In the year 794, the Japanese imperial court moved its capital to a new city. It was called Heian-kyo, which means capital of peace and tranquility. Today, this place is known as Kyoto, but in those early centuries it was still a fresh vision, a city designed with symmetry, wide avenues, and the influence of Chinese planning. Inside this elegant new capital, life for the aristocracy was one of poetry, ritual, and refinement. Courtiers wore layered silks, composed delicate verses, and competed for influence in an endless game of etiquette and charm. The Heian period is remembered for its literature, its art, and the beauty of the court. Works like the Tale of Genji were written in these years, capturing a world of subtle gestures and quiet passions. But beyond the polished palaces of Kyoto lay a very different Japan. The provinces stretched far across mountains, rivers, and coastlines. Villages were scattered and isolated. Roads were rough, and the further one travelled from the capital, the less authority the court truly held. Farmers tended rice paddies, local lords managed their lands, and conflicts between neighbours were not uncommon. Bandits roamed remote areas, and rival families often clashed over borders and water rights. While the aristocrats of Heian-kyo spent their days exchanging poems and attending festivals, the countryside required something more practical: armed men to protect the land. It was in this contrast between the grace of the capital and the hardship of the provinces that the figure of the samurai first began to take shape. At first, they were not yet the warriors of legend. They were attendants, guards, retainers. They were men who stood between the refined world of Kyoto and the unpredictable realities of rural Japan. This early balance, the elegance of the court and the rough strength of the provinces, set the stage for the rise of a new warrior class, one that would grow steadily in importance as the centuries passed. As the Heian court grew older, it began to face a quiet problem. The empire was beautiful in poetry and ritual, but in practice it was costly to maintain. The central government relied heavily on taxes from farmers across the provinces. Yet over time, clever aristocrats and influential Buddhist temples found ways to avoid paying those taxes. A shoen could be granted to a noble family, to a religious monastery, or even to members of the imperial household. Once land became part of a shoen, it slipped away from government control. Taxes were no longer collected, and the central treasury received less each year. Instead, the wealth of the land flowed directly to the noble or temple that owned it. For the court aristocrats, shoen were a way to secure power far beyond Kyoto. For temples, they were a means of supporting monks, rituals, and magnificent halls. But for the imperial government, the system created weakness. With each new shoen, the court's reach into the provinces grew thinner. At the same time, these estates needed protection. Rice was valuable, and without soldiers, harvests could be stolen or villages attacked. Local strongmen and landowners began to employ warriors to guard their estates. In some cases, entire families were devoted to this task. What began as a simple solution protecting farmland slowly transformed into something far greater. Those who guarded the shoen were no longer seen as ordinary peasants with spears. They became recognized as a distinct class of fighting men. Step by step, the presence of the estate system gave these early warriors purpose, income, and legitimacy. They were not just defending crops, they were building reputations, forging family names, and laying the foundations for what would one day be known as the samurai. At first, the men who served the great estates were little more than guards. They stood watch over rice fields, escorted shipments along rough roads, and defended villages against bandits. Many were mounted archers, for the horse was a symbol of power and speed in early Japan. But over time, their role deepened. These men were not merely hired muscle. They were often of noble birth themselves, younger sons of aristocratic families, or provincial landowners seeking honor and income. Unlike the peasant farmer who took up a spear for a season, these retainers trained year after year. They became specialists in the bow, the sword, and the art of mounted combat. It was here that the identity of the warrior began to shift. The word saburao meant to serve. At first it referred simply to attendants who stood close by a noble, ready to obey. Yet gradually, those who served with weapons gained recognition as a unique group. They were protectors, fighters, men of both skill and loyalty. As estates grew and conflicts spread, their importance only increased. Courts in Kyoto might dismiss them as rough men from the countryside, but their power was undeniable. In the provinces, it was not poetry or etiquette that brought safety. It was the presence of strong riders with bows drawn, watching over the land. This slow change marked the birth of something new. Guards became warriors, retainers became leaders, and families who carried swords on behalf of their lords began to imagine a destiny of their own. Among these early fighters, certain lineages rose to prominence. They were not just wandering guards, but families with noble roots and growing reputations. The Minamoto clan traced its heritage back to imperial princes. Members of the family had been given the surname Minamoto when they left the direct imperial line, and from these branches came men who carried both noble blood and martial ambition. The Taira clan was much the same, descended from emperors of earlier centuries. Over time, both Minamoto and Taira spread into the provinces, where they managed lands and commanded warriors. At first, these families served the aristocracy of Kyoto. They enforced the will of noble houses and defended their estates. But soon, they were defending their own lands and clashing with one another. These rivalries were not yet the great wars that history would later remember, but they planted the seeds. Warriors discovered that their names carried weight, that loyalty could extend to bloodlines as much as to emperors, and that the sword could shape reputation as surely as poetry or politics. The Minamoto, the Taira, and others like them stood at the frontier between the refined world of Heian culture and the rugged demands of the provinces. In their hands, the role of the warrior family began to take shape, not just servants but leaders in their own right. The contrast between Kyoto and the provinces grew sharper with each passing generation. In the capital, noble families lived according to a rhythm of festivals, poetry competitions, and court rituals. Theirs was a world of painted screens, incense, and delicate layers of silk. A misplaced word or an imperfect bow could alter one's fortunes more than a sword ever could. But in the provinces, life moved to different cycles. The planting of rice, the flood of rivers, the harvest, and the threat of raiders shaped the year. Homes were simpler, food was plainer, and security was never guaranteed. A strong arm and a loyal retainer could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin. It was in this countryside setting that warriors became indispensable. They were not only protectors of fields, they were symbols of order in a world where the emperor's voice was distant and faint. The samurai would always carry this duality, tied by blood and duty to the refined culture of Kyoto, yet hardened by the demands of provincial life. They stood with one foot in the elegance of the court, and the other in the mud of the paddies. Language reveals much about history, and the very word samurai carries the essence of its origins. The root, saburao, means to serve. In its earliest sense, it did not describe a warrior at all, but rather anyone who attended upon a noble, a servant, an attendant, one who stood close by and was ready to act. Over time, however, the word narrowed. It came to be associated not with every kind of servant, but with those who served with weapons in hand. The guardians of estates, the mounted retainers of noble families, the men whose duty was not poetry but protection, these became known as the samurai. This linguistic shift mirrored a social one. As warriors grew in prominence, society needed a word that distinguished them. Thus, what began as a verb, to serve, became a title, a class, and ultimately a symbol of Japan itself. By the late Heian period, the balance of power was beginning to tilt. The imperial court still glittered in Kyoto, its nobles writing verses and pursuing beauty. But in the provinces, warrior families were growing ever stronger. They commanded men, controlled land, and kept the peace in ways the distant government could not. The divide between centre and countryside widened. The court relied on warriors to enforce its will, yet feared the strength they were gathering. For the samurai themselves, each generation brought new confidence. They were no longer just the attendants of noblemen. They were becoming a force of their own. The seeds were sown. Out of estates and provinces, out of families like the Minamoto and the Taira, out of service and loyalty and bloodshed, the samurai would rise. The quiet origins of the warrior class were complete. Soon Japan would enter an age where these men of the sword would step from the shadows of the nobility and stand at the very heart of the nation's history. By the late 12th century, the warrior families of Japan had grown too powerful to remain only servants of the court. For generations, they had guarded the distant provinces, protected fields, and fought in the name of noble houses. But as their numbers grew and their reputations deepened, so too did their ambitions. The imperial court in Kyoto was still the center of elegance. Nobles competed in poetry and politics, debating over ceremonies and alliances. Yet outside the capital, the reality was different. The land was vast, its mountains high, and its roads uncertain. In those provinces, it was not the emperor's decree that carried weight, but the strength of a family's warriors. Among these warrior clans, two rose above the rest, the Taira and the Minamoto. The Taira clan traced its lineage to Emperor Kanmu. They were wealthy, deeply tied to Kyoto, and for a time, they even held high offices within the imperial court. Their leader, Taira no Kiyomori, wielded power not only through the sword but through politics. His family married into the imperial line, placing their blood close to the throne. The Minamoto clan, by contrast, had spread far into the provinces. They were men of the frontier, with roots in noble blood but strength drawn from their control of distant lands. Their power lay in their ability to raise armies quickly and decisively, calling upon retainers who had trained for generations. These two families, bound by pride, ambition, and history, became natural rivals. Their conflicts were not merely personal. They were the struggles of two visions of Japan, one rooted in the court, wealth and influence, the other in the provinces, discipline and military might. Tension deepened, small battles flared, allegiances shifted, the balance of Japan trembled, and so the seeds of a greater conflict were planted. A war that would bring destruction, reshape the nation, and firmly place the warrior class at the very heart of Japanese history. The conflict between the Taira and the Minamoto reached its breaking point in the year 11. What began as political rivalry in Kyoto soon unfolded into open war, a war that would last 5 years and shape the destiny of Japan. It is remembered as the Genpei War, named after the Chinese characters used for the two clans, Genji for the Minamoto and Heike for the Taira. The spark came when a prince of the imperial family, supported by the Minamoto, rose in rebellion against the Taira's dominance. The Taira, led by Taira no Kiyomori, held great power in the court, but their enemies were many. Resentment of their wealth and influence gave the Minamoto an opportunity to act. The war began with the Battle of Uji, near Kyoto. There, Minamoto warriors made a desperate stand on a wooden bridge across the river. With arrows flying and blades drawn, they tore up the planks beneath their feet to slow the enemy's advance. Though the Minamoto were defeated, their courage was remembered as the first chapter of a much longer struggle. In the years that followed, battles raged across the land. The Taira, strong at sea and close to the capital, fought to maintain control. The Minamoto, commanding allies in the provinces, struck from the countryside with speed and determination. At Ichinotani, Minamoto forces charged down steep cliffs, surprising the Taira camp and shattering their defenses. At Yoshima, a daring raid forced the Taira to abandon their stronghold and flee to the sea. The war was not only about great battles. For ordinary people, it brought fire and famine. Villages were caught between armies, harvests destroyed, and families displaced. What for the warriors was a struggle for power. For the peasants was often a struggle for survival. Yet with each passing year, the Minamoto grew stronger. Their leaders, Minamoto no Yoshinaka, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, and finally Minamoto no Yoritomo, carved their names into legend. Against them the Taira weakened, their fleets and strongholds slowly falling one by one. By 1185 the stage was set for the war's dramatic conclusion, a final confrontation at sea that would decide the fate of both clans. The final act of the Genpei War came in the spring of 1185. The place was Dan-no-ura, a narrow strait in the western seas of Japan, where tides ran swift and treacherous. Here, the forces of the Taira and the Minamoto prepared for one last desperate battle. The Taira still held a powerful fleet. They carried with them the young Emperor Antoku, a child only 6 years old, placed upon the throne through their family's influence. For the Taira, the boy was both their hope and their burden, the living symbol of their claim to rule. The Minamoto fleet, under the command of Minamoto no Yoshitsune, faced them across the waters. Yoshitsune was a daring and brilliant commander, known for his speed, his bold strategies, and his refusal to accept defeat. The battle began with the clash of arrows. Waves echoed with the creak of bows, the whistle of shafts, and the cries of men. Ships closed upon one another, warriors leaping from deck to deck, blades flashing in the sun. At first the tide favoured the Taira. They knew the currents well, and their archers struck hard, but the Minamoto found an advantage. Secretly, they had won the loyalty of a Taira defector, who revealed which ship carried the emperor. With this knowledge, the Minamoto pressed the attack, focusing their fury upon the heart of the enemy fleet. As the tide literally turned, so too did the battle. The currents of Dan-no-ura shifted suddenly, sweeping Taira ships into confusion. Minamoto warriors seized the moment, boarding enemy vessels, cutting down defenders, and driving survivors into the sea. Realizing all was lost, the Taira made a final, tragic choice. Rather than surrender, many threw themselves into the waves. Women of the clan carried the young Emperor Antoku into their arms and leapt together into the depths. With them sank not only the imperial child, but also sacred treasures, the regalia of Japan, mirrors, jewels, and swords, said to be gifts of the gods. By the battle's end, the Taira were no more. Their power was broken, their family scattered, their name consigned to memory. The Minamoto stood victorious. From this day, the warrior class would not only protect the land, they would rule it. When the waves of Dan no Ura grew quiet, and the Taira were no more, it was the Minamoto who emerged as masters of Japan. Yet victory alone did not guarantee peace. Someone had to hold the reins of power. That man was Minamoto no Yoritomo. Yoritomo had not fought on the front lines like his younger brother Yoshitsune. Instead, he ruled with caution and calculation. From his base in the coastal town of Kamakura, far from the shining palaces of Kyoto, Yoritomo built something new, a government shaped not by courtiers, but by warriors. In 1192, Yoritomo was granted the title of Sei Taishogun, Great General, Subduer of the Barbarians. The title had existed before, but under Yoritomo, it took on an entirely new meaning. He was no longer a servant of the court, he was its equal. Thus began the Kamakura Shogunate, the first military government in Japanese history. From Kamakura, Yoritomo appointed stewards to manage lands and constables to enforce order. Samurai who had fought for him were rewarded with estates, while those who wavered in loyalty were stripped of their holdings. For the first time, warriors did not simply defend the state, they were the state. The emperor still sat upon the throne in Kyoto, draped in silks and surrounded by rituals. But real power now lay elsewhere. It lay in the hands of the shogun and his network of loyal samurai, men who held their positions not through poetry or ceremony, but through service and the sword. This shift marked a turning point in Japanese history. The age of the court was fading. The age of the warrior had begun. With the rise of Minamoto no Yoritomo, Japan entered a new age. No longer would warriors simply stand at the edges of noble households, guarding fields and escorting nobles. They had become the very fabric of government itself. This new system was built upon loyalty and reward. Samurai pledged their service to the shogun, or to his appointed stewards and constables. In return, they were granted land, income, and the prestige of official rank. Their duty was clear: to maintain peace, to enforce order, and to stand ready in times of war. The emperor remained in Kyoto, but his role was now largely symbolic. Ceremonies continued, poetry was written, and the court still glittered with elegance. Yet the power of decision, the power of armies, justice and law, rested in Kamakura, in the hands of the shogunate. For the samurai themselves, this was both honor and burden. They were expected to embody discipline, loyalty and readiness. Service was their life, and their families depended upon their conduct. Betrayal was punished swiftly, while devotion could raise a family to lasting prominence. Thus, by the end of the 12th century, the warrior class was no longer simply rising. They had risen. From the quiet beginnings in distant provinces, from the struggles of the Genpei War, and from the leadership of Yoritomo, the samurai had claimed their place as the rulers of Japan. It was the dawn of a new order, the order of the warrior. By the 13th century, the samurai were firmly established as Japan's ruling class. They held lands, served lords, and shaped the nation's politics. Yet power alone was not enough. A class built upon the sword needed something deeper, a set of values that could guide their actions and give meaning to both life and death. From this need emerged a way of thinking, a way of living, that came to be known as Bushido, the way of the warrior. At first, Bushido was not written as a single code. It was not a book of laws carved in stone. Instead, it was a collection of ideals, passed down through families, refined by teachers, and remembered in stories. Each generation added to it, shaping it according to their struggles. Its roots stretched into many traditions. From Confucianism, the samurai learned loyalty, duty, and respect for hierarchy. From Buddhism, they took the understanding that life was fleeting and that death was not to be feared. From Shinto, they inherited reverence for ancestors and the purity of devotion. Over time, these influences merged into something uniquely their own. Bushido came to mean honor above all, loyalty to one's lord, courage in battle, and dignity in death. For the samurai, this way of life was not merely an idea, it was a promise to their family, to their lord, and to themselves. It was a compass in the uncertain world of politics and war. Thus, out of centuries of service and conflict, the warrior's path gained its soul. Honor was the measure of a man's worth. It was not simply pride, nor the respect of others, but a quiet, unshakable sense of integrity. To live without honor was to live as a shadow, empty of meaning. For the samurai, a single disgrace could outweigh years of service. Reputation was fragile, and once broken, it could never truly be restored. Loyalty was the bond that held the warrior to his lord. A samurai's life was not his own. It was bound by oath to the master he served. This devotion was expected to be absolute, unbroken by hardship or temptation. To betray one's lord was the deepest shame a warrior could endure, and loyalty often extended beyond life itself. Even in death, a samurai was expected to protect the honor of the one he served. Duty, or giri, was the weight of obligation that guided a samurai's every action. It was duty to family, duty to ancestors, duty to one's lord, and duty to the code itself. This sense of obligation was not always comfortable. At times it demanded sacrifice, the surrender of personal desire for the sake of a greater responsibility. Yet it was precisely this burden that gave the samurai's life its structure and meaning. Together, honor, loyalty, and duty formed a triangle of values that could not be broken. To lose one was to weaken the others. To uphold all three was to walk firmly upon the path of Bushido. And so, in times of peace and in moments of war, these ideals became the measure by which every samurai was judged, not only by others, but in the silence of his own heart. For the samurai, courage was more than a flash of bravery on the battlefield. It was a quiet strength, a steadiness of spirit, that guided them in every moment of life. True courage was not reckless, nor was it loud. It was the ability to act rightly, even when the path was difficult, and to face hardship without fear. At the heart of this courage was a profound truth: death was always near. The samurai were taught from an early age to meditate upon their mortality. Life was fleeting, fragile as a falling blossom, and could end in a single stroke. To cling desperately to life was seen as weakness, but to accept death with calm dignity was considered strength. This belief did not make the samurai careless. Instead, it gave them freedom. A man who had already accepted the inevitability of death could fight without hesitation, serve without fear, and live each day with clarity. Courage was not only shown in battle, it appeared in the endurance of hardship, in the refusal to betray duty, and in the willingness to sacrifice for family and lord. A samurai might never draw his sword, yet his courage could be measured in how he carried himself through life. Thus, courage and the acceptance of death became inseparable. One gave meaning to the other. Together, they shaped the samurai's spirit into something both resilient and serene, a way of living fully, even while knowing that every dawn could be the last. Among the practices most associated with the samurai, none is more striking or more misunderstood than seppuku, ritual suicide. To the outside world, it may seem a grim and fearful act, yet to the samurai, it was regarded as the ultimate expression of honor. If a warrior had failed in his duty, suffered defeat, or brought shame upon his name, he was not expected to live with dishonor. Instead, he could choose to end his life by his own hand, preserving dignity even in death. The ritual was deliberate and solemn. A samurai would dress in white, the color of purity. He would compose a death poem, a final reflection upon the fleeting beauty of life. Before witnesses, he would kneel, steady his breath, and open his body with his blade. Often, a trusted companion stood behind him, ready to deliver the swift stroke that ended his suffering. To perform seppuku was not an act of despair, but of resolve. It was a statement that one's loyalty, honor, and duty outweighed even the instinct to live. In this way, seppuku reflected the very heart of Bushido, the acceptance of death, transformed into an affirmation of values. Yet it was not a path taken lightly. To choose seppuku was to embrace the greatest sacrifice, leaving behind family, home, and the beauty of the world. It was an act of final service, both to one's lord and to one's own spirit. For centuries, this practice shaped the image of the samurai, men whose commitment was so absolute that even life itself could be offered to protect their name. To the samurai, death with dignity was not defeat, but the fulfillment of the way. Bushido did not appear from nothing. It was not invented in a single moment, nor written by a single hand. Instead, it was shaped slowly, drawn from the great traditions that had flowed through Japan for centuries. From Confucianism, inherited from China, the samurai learned structure and order. Confucian teaching placed harmony above chaos and duty above desire. It taught respect for hierarchy, loyalty to superiors, and the importance of filial piety, devotion to one's parents and ancestors. These lessons became woven deeply into the samurai's sense of obligation to both lord and family. From Buddhism, and especially from Zen, came a quieter influence. Buddhism taught that life was impermanent, that all things were fleeting, and that attachment to the world only brought suffering. For the warrior, this understanding gave calmness in the face of death. Meditation, discipline, and mindfulness became tools not only for the temple, but for the battlefield. In the silence of a garden, or in the stillness before combat, the samurai found strength in detachment. From Shinto, the native spirit of Japan, came reverence for purity, nature, and ancestry. Shinto taught that the divine was present in all things, in the wind through pines, in flowing rivers, and in the spirits of those who came before. For the samurai, To live honorably was not only a duty to one's lord, but also a duty to the gods and to one's lineage. Together, these three traditions formed a foundation. Confucianism gave the samurai order, Buddhism gave them calm, Shinto gave them reverence. Out of these influences, Bushido became not just a code of warriors, but a way of life, a bridge between the sword and the spirit. Though Bushido is often spoken of as if it were a single, perfect code, the truth was more complex. For many samurai, Bushido was an ideal, a vision of what the warrior should be. It spoke of loyalty without question, honor without stain, and courage without fear. It was a compass pointing toward perfection, a light to guide the warrior's path. But in daily life, reality was less certain. Samurai were not always flawless. Loyalty shifted, betrayals occurred, and ambition sometimes outweighed duty. Wars were fought not only for honor, but for land, wealth, and power. And yet, even when the code was broken, the idea of Bushido remained powerful. It gave the warrior class an image to aspire to, a standard by which they judged themselves and others. In times of peace, it inspired poetry, art, and careful training. In times of war, it gave men the courage to face death with calm. Thus, Bushido was both truth and myth. It was practiced imperfectly, yet believed in deeply. Over centuries, it became less about what every samurai actually did, and more about what every samurai was expected to be. In this way, Bushido shaped not only the warrior's world, but Japan itself. It became part of the nation's memory, a story of discipline and devotion, of service and sacrifice, a story that lived on long after the warriors themselves had passed. The life of a samurai began long before he ever touched a sword. It began in the hush of a household, in the quiet rituals that welcomed a child into the world. In samurai families, the birth of a child was not only a moment of joy, but a matter of importance to the entire household. Every child carried the hopes of the lineage, the continuation of a name, the preservation of honor, and the promise of service. Whether boy or girl, a newborn was greeted with ceremony, for in that tiny life lay the weight of generations. At birth, the infant was swaddled in soft cloth, often white to symbolize purity. Mothers, attended by midwives and family members, observed rituals meant to protect the child from misfortune. Offerings might be made at the household shrine, prayers whispered to ancestral spirits. The cry of a newborn was seen as an auspicious sound, a sign that the child had entered the world with strength. Naming was itself a ritual. Names in samurai families were carefully chosen, often linked to ancestors, virtues, or auspicious characters from Chinese classics. The name carried more than identity. It carried expectation. A boy might be named for courage, loyalty, or wisdom, virtues that his family hoped he would one day embody. A girl's name might reflect grace, beauty, or strength of spirit, qualities valued in women who were destined to guide households and, in times of need, defend them. Childhood in samurai families was not without affection. Parents cared deeply for their children, and diaries from the era speak of the joy of watching infants grow. Mothers, in particular, were central figures, shaping the earliest years with both tenderness and discipline. Songs, lullabies, and simple toys filled the home. Dolls were carved from wood, balls sewn from cloth. These small joys balanced the weight of duty that would come later. Yet from an early age, children were reminded of who they were. A boy born into a samurai household was never an ordinary child. Even in his games, he was expected to prepare for the path ahead. Wooden swords were placed in his hands as toys, teaching familiarity with the weapon long before skill. Small bows were given, so that the motions of drawing and aiming became second nature. Stories were told at night, not only tales of gods and spirits, but of ancestors who had served with loyalty and courage. Around the hearth, a boy might listen to the exploits of his grandfather or great-grandfather, learning that he carried the same blood, the same duty. In this way, honor was not merely taught, but breathed in like air. Girls, too, were raised with care. Though their futures often lay in managing households, their education was no less serious. Many were taught the use of the naginata, the long polearm that became a symbol of women in samurai culture. Diaries speak of mothers who trained with their daughters, preparing them not only for domestic roles, but for the possibility of defending the home in times of unrest. A girl's strength was measured not only in gentleness, but in readiness. Clothing for children reflected their place in society. Infants wore simple robes, but as they grew, garments displayed family crests. Even a child's attire reminded them that they belonged to something larger than themselves, a lineage, a clan, a tradition. By the age of 7, a boy might be sent to live with another family, often relatives or allies, to learn discipline outside the indulgence of his parents. This practice, known as yoshi, was both a test and a training. A child grew in resilience. learning loyalty to his foster household while never forgetting his true family. Education began early. Alongside physical training came lessons in reading and writing. The Chinese classics, texts of philosophy, governance, and poetry were introduced in childhood. Boys learned to copy characters with brush and ink, developing patience and precision. Girls too studied reading and writing, for literacy was a mark of refinement in samurai households. Discipline was ever present. A child was taught respect for elders, obedience to parents, and humility in speech. Courtesy was not a formality, but a foundation. A bow, a word, a gesture, all carried meaning, shaping the child into one who could one day stand with dignity among others. Seasons marked the rhythm of childhood. In spring, blossoms were admired, their brief beauty teaching the lesson of impermanence. In summer, children played outdoors, swimming in rivers, running through fields, their strength growing with the heat. Autumn brought harvest festivals, where children learned gratitude for the bounty of the land. Winter meant nights by the hearth, listening to stories, practicing calligraphy, and building resilience against the cold. The home itself was the first school. A child learned not only from parents but from the servants, retainers, and elders who filled the household. Each interaction reinforced the values of service, humility, and respect. To be samurai was not a role chosen, it was a role absorbed from the moment of birth. And so, by the time a samurai child reached the age of 10, much had already been instilled. The bow was no longer unfamiliar. The brush was steady in the hand. Honor and duty were words not only spoken but lived in daily practice. Childhood had prepared the ground. Soon youth would bring training, and training would lead to the life of service that defined the warrior class. In this way, the earliest years of a samurai's life were both tender and weighty, a balance of affection and expectation. The child was cherished as family, yet shaped as a vessel of duty. From the moment of birth, every samurai walked a path that belonged not only to himself, but to the generations who came before and the generations who would follow. As the child of a samurai grew older, play gave way to discipline. The household that once celebrated lullabies and simple toys now turned its attention to training. For a boy, this was the first step onto the long road of warriorhood. For a girl, it was the preparation for a life of both household leadership and quiet strength. Training began not with the sword, but with the bow. In the early centuries of the samurai, the bow was the true symbol of the warrior. A young boy was given a small yumi, the long asymmetrical Japanese bow suited to his size. Day after day, he practiced the motions of drawing, breathing, and releasing. At first, arrows flew short and clumsy, falling to the ground before the target. Yet the point was not accuracy, but form. The body learned through repetition, until motion became second nature. Horseback riding was introduced just as early. The horse was not only a means of travel, but a partner in battle. To ride with balance, to guide with knees and hands, to remain steady even at speed, these were lessons taught patiently, often by retainers who had spent lifetimes in the saddle. It was said that a samurai should be as comfortable on horseback as on the ground, and so from youth, children were placed upon ponies, guided around yards and fields until confidence replaced fear. The sword, though iconic, came later. Wooden swords, or bokken, were given to boys as tools of practice. At first they were used in play, mock duels between brothers or friends. But under the watch of elders, these games became lessons. Stance was corrected, grips adjusted, strikes measured for control. The goal was not to defeat, but to learn balance, patience, and timing. Training was not always formal. Much of it was woven into daily life. A boy might be asked to carry buckets of water from the river, strengthening arms and legs. Chores became practice, splitting wood, grinding grain, sweeping courtyards, all teaching endurance and humility. To serve the household was itself part of the warrior's path. Discipline extended beyond the body. A child was expected to memorize poems, copy Chinese characters, and listen to readings of history. Knowledge was as vital as strength. A samurai who could not read, could not understand orders, nor appreciate the wisdom of the past. To wield a brush was considered equal to wielding a blade. The two were never separated. Girls too received training. While their brothers drew bows and mounted horses, they learned to wield the naginata, the long polearm that gave reach and protection. It was both a weapon and a symbol, teaching grace in motion and steadiness of spirit. In times of peace, it was practiced as exercise. In times of danger, it could mean survival. Women were also trained in household management, learning how to direct servants, manage resources, and keep records. The smooth running of an estate was as important to a family's honor as the prowess of its warriors. Instruction often came from within the family. Fathers guided their sons, passing down lessons learned on campaign. Mothers instructed daughters, teaching strength balanced with gentleness. Retainers, elders, and tutors filled the gaps, each contributing their skill to the child's formation. The pace was steady, unhurried, yet relentless. Each morning began early, sometimes before dawn, with physical exercise or weapon drills. Days might be filled with study, chores, or practice in the yard. Evenings often brought reflection, reciting poems, copying texts, or listening to stories of great warriors. In this way, the cycle of training blended seamlessly into daily life. Ritual and ceremony accompanied the milestones. At around 15, a boy underwent his Jempuku, the coming-of-age ceremony. His childhood name was set aside, and he received an adult name, often linked to ancestors or virtues. His hair was styled in the adult fashion, and he was formally recognized as a man, ready to serve. For many, this was also the first time he was allowed to wear the long sword, the daito, symbol of his status. The training of youth was not without hardship. Pain, mistakes, and failure were expected. A boy who stumbled was corrected. A girl who faltered was guided again. Endurance was praised above talent. To suffer quietly, to rise after falling, to continue without complaint, these were seen as marks of true character. Stories from the period remind us of how seriously this training was taken. Chronicles tell of young warriors who practiced archery until their fingers bled, or who recited passages of philosophy late into the night by the dim light of oil lamps. Yet such efforts were not regarded as burdens. They were seen as steps upon a path that was larger than the individual, a path that stretched back to ancestors and forward to descendants. Even in these years, the seeds of Bushido were planted. Children learned loyalty through obedience to their parents and teachers. They learned honor in the way they carried themselves, even when unseen. They learned duty in every chore and every lesson, for nothing was considered too small when shaping a life of service. Thus, by the time a samurai youth reached adulthood, his training was already deeply rooted. His body was strong, his mind prepared, his spirit disciplined. He was no longer merely a child of the household, but a servant of the clan, ready to step into the responsibilities of his station. In this way, the training of youth was not only preparation for war, it was the shaping of character, the molding of spirit, the creation of a way of life. From these quiet years of practice and learning, the samurai emerged as men and women bound to their code, carrying within them both the strength of arms and the calmness of discipline. When we imagine the samurai today, we often think first of grand castles, towering walls, deep moats, and sweeping roofs that seem to rise like mountains of stone and wood. Yet the homes of the samurai were not always so imposing. In their earliest centuries, their dwellings were far simpler, shaped by practicality and the rhythms of the land. A samurai's home was usually constructed of timber, with walls made not of stone but of wood and paper screens. The walls were thin, designed to breathe with the changing seasons. In summer, they could be slid open to allow the breeze to flow through. In winter, they shut tight, leaving only the dim warmth of a hearth to keep away the cold. Inside, rooms were laid with tatami mats, soft woven straw that gave a sense of order and calm. Furniture was minimal, a few chests for storage, a low table for writing or meals, cushions for sitting. The simplicity was deliberate. Clutter was seen as distraction. Even in the home, the life of a samurai reflected discipline. Sliding screens divided the rooms. These shoji, made of paper stretched across wooden frames, allowed light to filter gently into the space, creating a glow that softened every corner. By day, sunlight drifted through in muted shades. By night, lamps placed behind the screens gave a warm and steady glow, turning the house into a lantern against the darkness. Gardens were an extension of the home. A samurai's dwelling often opened onto a small yard, where stones were carefully arranged. Moss grew in shaded corners, and water flowed through channels or pools. These gardens were not luxuries, but expressions of order and balance. To step into one was to step into a world of quiet reflection, where each stone and each plant had been chosen with thought. Castles, as we imagine them now, came later. During the Sengoku, or Warring States period, Japan erupted into conflict between rival daimyos. In this age of constant war, wooden homes were no longer enough. Stone bases rose, walls thickened, and moats were dug deep to hold back enemies. Towers climbed into the sky, offering both protection and a symbol of power. Within these castles, life was more complex. The central keep, the Tenshu, served as both command post and residence for the lord. Around it stretched layers of courtyards, gates and walls, designed to delay attackers and confuse intruders. Inside, the same principles of simplicity remained, but now the scale was grander. Tatami floors covered great halls, sliding screens bore painted landscapes, turning the walls into works of art. For the samurai who served within these castles, life was ordered by rank. High retainers lived closer to the lord, their quarters more spacious and adorned. Lower retainers lived further out, in humbler rooms, though still within the castle's protection. Every placement reflected loyalty, service, and status. Yet whether in a simple wooden home of the early centuries, or a sprawling castle of the later age, the atmosphere remained the same: quiet discipline. A samurai household was not a place of excess. Even in wealth, restraint was expected. The home was a place of order, a place where every object served a purpose. Meals were taken in small rooms, often on the floor around a low table. Armor was stored carefully, cleaned and maintained after every use. Weapons were displayed not as decorations but as reminders of duty. Family crests might be painted on screens or embroidered into cloth, ensuring that even within the walls of the home, identity and lineage were always present. The household was not only for the family. Retainers, servants, and sometimes students filled the spaces. The samurai's home was a living community, bound together by loyalty and service. Each person knew their place, their role, their duty. Harmony came not from equality, but from the balance of obligations. At night, the house grew silent. Paper walls allowed every sound to travel: the wind, the call of insects, the shifting of a floorboard. Families gathered around the hearth, sharing warmth and stories. Outside, guards kept watch, for even the strongest castle was never beyond the threat of attack. In times of peace, the home was a sanctuary. In times of war, it became a fortress, a place where families endured uncertainty, where women defended gates, and children waited for news of fathers and brothers on distant fields. Thus the samurai home, whether humble or grand, was always more than wood and stone. It was the vessel of tradition, the keeper of lineage, and the stage upon which daily life unfolded. In its simplicity lay dignity, in its strength lay protection, and in its quietness lay the heart of the samurai way. The food of the samurai was never only about nourishment. It was about rhythm, about discipline, and about harmony with the seasons. What was placed upon a samurai's table reflected not only the bounty of the land, but also the values of simplicity, restraint, and balance that shaped his way of life. At the heart of every meal was rice. Rice was more than food. It was the foundation of Japanese society. Fields of rice defined the wealth of provinces, taxes were measured in bushels of rice, and a family's prosperity was tied to the quality of its harvest. For the samurai, rice was both daily sustenance and symbol of order. Each grain was considered precious, grown with care, tended through the cycles of planting and harvest, and eaten with gratitude. Alongside rice came vegetables. Radishes, turnips, burdock root, and greens filled the bowls. Pickled vegetables, tsukemono, added color and preserved flavor through the changing seasons. These pickles were not mere side dishes, they carried meaning. The sourness of pickled plums, umeboshi, was believed to cleanse the body and sharpen the mind. A small wrinkled plum atop white rice was a common sight, simple yet complete. Protein came from many sources. Fish, fresh in coastal regions, salted or dried inland, was a common staple. Meat was less frequent, though hunters sometimes brought venison or wild boar. Tofu, made from soybeans, provided another form of nourishment, humble yet versatile. In times of scarcity, even miso soup, a broth of fermented soybean paste with bits of vegetables or seaweed, could sustain strength. Tea was ever present. At first, it was a simple drink, boiled leaves in water. But in time, it became ritual, refined into the tea ceremony that taught discipline, patience, and mindfulness. For the samurai, tea was not about flavor, but about the act itself. The careful pouring, the measured movements, the silent appreciation of the moment. Meals were eaten in quiet order. Samurai families sat on tatami mats around low tables. Chopsticks, carefully carved, were held with precision. Bowls were lifted respectfully to the lips, not bent over as if in haste. Every gesture mattered. Eating was not an indulgence, but a reflection of one's character. In wealthier households, presentation carried special weight. Lacquerware bowls shone with dark polish, accented with family crests. Trays were arranged with harmony in mind. Colors balanced, flavors contrasted, textures varied. Yet even in elegance, restraint was observed. Excess was frowned upon. A samurai's meal was meant to satisfy, not to overwhelm. Dining also carried ritual. Before meals, offerings were sometimes placed at a household shrine, a small portion of rice or tea given first to ancestors and spirits. This act of gratitude reminded the family that their sustenance came not only from the earth, but from the labors of those who came before. Seasonality shaped every dish. In spring, bamboo shoots and fresh greens marked the renewal of life. Summer meals were light, with chilled noodles and refreshing fruits. Autumn brought mushrooms, chestnuts, and the deep flavors of harvest. Winter meals were hearty, with simmered stews that gave warmth against the cold. To eat was to move with the seasons, never apart from them. Hospitality was also an important part of dining. Guests were offered the best portions, seated in places of honor, and served with care. A lord might host a feast for retainers, offering rice, fish, and sake as tokens of favor. Such gatherings strengthened bonds of loyalty, reminding all present that food was not only nourishment, but a symbol of unity. Children learned these rituals from an early age. They were taught how to sit properly, how to hold chopsticks, how to bow before and after a meal. Even at the table, discipline was instilled. To eat carelessly, or to leave food uneaten, was considered disrespectful. Gratitude was expected in every bite. In times of war, food was simpler still. Warriors carried dried rice, parched grains, or balls of rice wrapped in leaves. These rations were practical, sustaining men through long marches and sleepless nights. Even then, care was taken to preserve dignity. A warrior might pause before battle to eat quietly, centering his mind with a simple bowl of rice and tea. Thus, food in the samurai world was never just food. It was a reflection of values. Simplicity taught humility. Ritual taught mindfulness. Seasonality taught harmony with nature. In the act of eating, the samurai practiced the same discipline that guided him in battle, the same respect that bound him to his lord, the same calmness that allowed him to face life and death with equanimity. And so, at the samurai's table, one found not extravagance, but meaning. Each meal was a lesson in balance, a meditation in daily form, a reminder that the way of the warrior was not only lived with the sword, but also in the quiet act of lifting a bowl, bowing one's head, and tasting the fleeting gifts of the world. In the story of the samurai, the focus often falls upon men, warriors in armor, carrying swords, riding into battle. Yet within the household, the role of women was no less vital. They were the quiet strength of the family, the keepers of order, the guardians of both home and honor. Without them, the samurai class could not have endured. From the earliest days, a samurai wife was more than a companion. She was a partner in responsibility. When her husband went to war or traveled to serve his lord, it was she who managed the estate. Fields still needed to be sown, rents collected, servants directed. The smooth running of the household fell upon her shoulders, and her efficiency reflected not only upon herself, but upon her family's reputation. Women of samurai families were often educated. They could read and write, compose poetry, and keep records. Letters written by samurai wives reveal intelligence and dignity. Some corresponded with their husbands on campaign, sending words of encouragement or reminders of duty. Others managed accounts with precision, ensuring that resources were never wasted. Literacy was not only a skill, but a mark of refinement, binding women to the cultural life of the class. Training in arms was also part of a woman's world. Many were taught to wield the naginata, the long-bladed polearm whose reach made it a powerful weapon of defense. The naginata came to symbolize women of the warrior class, a reminder that even within the walls of the home, strength was expected. Mothers might instruct their daughters in its use, teaching not only technique but the spirit of readiness. In times of siege, it was not unusual for women to stand at gates, weapons in hand, defending their families. Yet the strength of samurai women was not measured only in battle. It was seen in their resolve, in their ability to endure hardship with dignity. Wives often faced long absences from their husbands, uncertain whether they would return. Mothers raised children knowing that sons might one day march to war, and daughters might be married far away for alliances. To carry these burdens without complaint was itself an act of courage. Marriage in the samurai world was often arranged, serving the interests of families and clans. Alliances were forged through unions, strengthening bonds between lords and vassals. A woman might leave her home to live among strangers, bringing with her not only dowry but also loyalty. Though such marriages were political, they could still blossom into affection. Surviving letters reveal tenderness between husbands and wives, evidence that duty and love could coexist. The influence of women reached beyond the household. Some became advisors, offering counsel to their husbands or sons. Chronicles mention mothers who reminded their sons of their duty before battle, urging them to act with honor. One well-known tale tells of a mother who, upon sending her son to war, warned him, "Return with honor, or return not at all." Such words reflected the weight women carried in shaping the spirit of the warrior. Samurai daughters, too, played roles of importance. Through marriage, they extended the reach of their families' alliances. Through education, they carried refinement into new households. Some became nuns, choosing lives of religious devotion, their prayers seen as a form of service equal to the sword. Others became remembered for their bravery, stepping into defense when no men remained. Not all women lived lives of power. Many endured hardship, especially in times of war. Sieges brought hunger, displacement, and loss. Yet even in these struggles, women of samurai families were expected to show composure. Diaries from the period tell of women who, in the face of destruction, maintained ritual, preparing tea or writing poetry as the world outside fell into chaos. The presence of women shaped the very character of the samurai household. They were the balance to the warrior's outward duty, the inner strength that sustained families through uncertainty. Their management ensured survival. Their resolve inspired courage. Their grace embodied the ideals of the class as much as any sword. In truth, the samurai way was never lived by men alone. It was shared, quietly but firmly, by the women who bore its burdens, upheld its traditions, and passed its spirit to the next generation. They were warriors of a different kind, guardians of the home, defenders of honor, and keepers of the unseen strength that made the visible strength of men possible. For the samurai, the path of the warrior was never meant to be defined by the sword alone. A true samurai was expected to carry not only strength of body, but refinement of mind. Education was therefore woven deeply into daily life, shaping warriors into men and women who could read, write, and appreciate the arts as fully as they could wield a blade. From childhood, sons of samurai families were taught to read the Chinese classics. These texts, works of history, philosophy, and poetry, had long been revered in Japan. They taught lessons of loyalty, order, and harmony, virtues that resonated with the ideals of the warrior class. To copy a passage of Confucius or to recite a verse of Chinese poetry was seen not merely as study, but as moral training. The lessons of loyalty to lord and family were not only spoken at home, they were reinforced by the words of sages whose voices echoed across centuries. Calligraphy was among the most prized skills. The samurai child would sit with brush and inkstone, dipping carefully into black ink, and practice character after character upon white paper. Each stroke required patience, precision, and calm. To rush was to ruin the form. To hesitate was to break the line. The act itself was a kind of meditation, shaping not only the characters but the spirit of the writer. A steady hand with a brush was considered as important as a steady hand with a bow. Girls too received education, especially in families of higher standing. Many learned to read, write, and compose poetry. A samurai wife who could manage accounts, compose letters, and exchange refined verses was respected not only for her skill, but for the dignity she brought to her household. In this way, literacy became a marker of class, distinguishing the samurai from peasants who lived by toil alone. Poetry held a special place in samurai culture. The short form of waka, with its 5 lines and 31 syllables, was especially beloved. Warriors composed verses on the moon, on falling blossoms, on the stillness of the night before battle. These poems, often simple in words, carried depths of feeling. They revealed that beneath the armor and discipline, the samurai heart remained sensitive to beauty, aware of the fleeting nature of life. One famous example comes from Minamoto no Yorimasa, who, facing defeat in battle, composed his death poem before committing seppuku. Like a drawn bow, I have no more strength to give. Now I must release and let the arrow of life fly toward eternity. Such poems were not only artistic expression, they were reflections of philosophy. To live with awareness of impermanence, to express dignity even in death. This was the spirit of Bushido, carried into words as surely as into deeds. Education also included history and law. Young samurai studied tales of past warriors, learning lessons of loyalty and betrayal. They learned the customs that governed inheritance, landholding, and duty. In this way, education was practical as well as cultural, preparing the samurai not only for the battlefield, but for leadership in governance. Music and art, too, were part of the world of refinement. Some samurai learned to play instruments such as the flute or the biwa, a kind of lute. Others practiced painting, often in the style of ink wash, where landscapes emerged from soft strokes of black on white. These arts were not indulgence, but balance. They reminded the warrior that strength without harmony led to chaos, while discipline in art reinforced discipline in life. The household itself was a place of constant learning. Elders recited stories, mothers guided children in recitation, tutors corrected brushwork, even retainers played a role, teaching practical lessons in discipline and skill. Learning was not confined to a classroom. It flowed through the rhythms of daily life, absorbed in every conversation and every gesture. Evenings were often devoted to reflection. By the light of oil lamps, children copied characters, fathers composed letters, and mothers wrote in diaries. Some families gathered to read aloud from classics, while others exchanged verses in playful competitions. These moments of quiet learning bound families together, turning the home into both a school and a sanctuary. Education was not abandoned in adulthood. Samurai continued to write poetry, practice calligraphy, and study philosophy throughout their lives. Letters between warriors reveal not only matters of politics, but reflections on nature, dreams, and personal thoughts. Even hardened generals found time to write of cherry blossoms or autumn moons. This union of sword and brush became one of the defining qualities of the samurai. To fight without refinement was to be a brute. To study without discipline was to be weak. Only by balancing both could a warrior truly embody the way. Thus, in the quiet scratch of brush on paper, in the rhythm of verses exchanged between friends, in the simple act of a child learning to shape a character, the spirit of the samurai was nurtured. Education and poetry were not separate from the warrior's life. They were its essence, teaching that strength must be guided by wisdom, and that honor must be carried not only in deeds but also in words. The life of a samurai was not shaped only by weapons, training, and duty. It was also guided by faith, by quiet ritual, and by the unseen world of spirits and ancestors. Religion formed the invisible thread that ran through the warrior's days, binding his life to those who came before and to the divine forces believed to shape the world. At the heart of the samurai's spiritual life were two traditions, Shinto and Buddhism. These were not seen as conflicting, but as complementary. A household could honor both, placing offerings at a Shinto shrine in the morning and sitting in meditation before a Buddhist altar in the evening. Together they created a balance between devotion to the kami, the gods and spirits of nature, and the teachings of impermanence, compassion, and discipline. Within the samurai home, small shrines were common. A kamadana, or god shelf, was often placed high upon a wall. Upon it stood small offerings: rice, salt, water, perhaps a sprig of evergreen. These were given daily to the kami, tokens of respect to the divine forces believed to dwell in rivers, mountains, and trees. The act was simple, but filled with meaning, a reminder that life was sustained not only by effort, but by grace. Beside the kamadana, many homes also kept a butsudan, a Buddhist altar. Here, incense was lit, prayers were whispered, and memorial tablets for ancestors were placed. Each morning and evening, family members bowed before the altar, offering gratitude for the guidance of those who had passed. In times of difficulty, prayers were made for strength and clarity. In times of mourning, the altar became the center of remembrance, a place where the bond between the living and the dead remained unbroken. Rituals marked the rhythm of the year. Shinto festivals celebrated the planting of rice, the changing of the seasons, the return of harvest. Villages came alive with music, dance, and offerings to the local kami. Samurai families joined these celebrations, for though they stood above peasants in rank, they shared the same dependence upon the land and its cycles. The sight of banners fluttering in the wind, lanterns glowing in the evening, and drums echoing through the air was familiar to warriors and farmers alike. Buddhist observances offered a quieter rhythm. Days of meditation, temple visits, and sutra recitations reminded the samurai of impermanence and detachment. Zen, in particular, held special influence. Warriors sought clarity of mind through stillness, finding strength not in noise but in silence. A samurai might rise early, kneel upon a mat, and sit in meditation as dawnlight crept into the room, training his spirit to be as steady as his hand. Death was a constant presence in samurai life, and religion offered a way to face it with dignity. Funerals were solemn, guided by Buddhist priests. Incense drifted in the air as chants filled the hall, guiding the spirit to its next journey. Families wore white or black, heads bowed in respect. For the samurai, death was not an end but a transformation, a return to the great cycle. Ritual gave order to grief, turning sorrow into acceptance. Daily rituals also reinforced discipline: to bow before a shrine, to light incense with care, to offer rice or tea with steady hands. These small acts trained the spirit in mindfulness. Just as sword practice sharpened the body, ritual sharpened awareness. The two were never separate, they were threads of the same fabric. Women often tended to these rituals. They maintained the household altars, prepared offerings, and taught children the prayers. In this way, faith was passed quietly from mother to child, shaping generations through rhythm and repetition. A boy who learned to bow before the kamadana each morning grew into a man who bowed before his lord with the same respect. Rituals of faith mirrored rituals of service. Even in times of war, religion remained close. Warriors carried small charms or amulets for protection, gifted by temples or shrines. Before battle, prayers were offered for courage. Victories were sometimes dedicated to the gods, defeats explained as lessons from the unseen world. Temples received donations in gratitude, their bells ringing as reminders that every triumph was fleeting, every life impermanent. Thus, religion was not distant from the life of the samurai. It was present in every bow, every offering, every whispered prayer. It was found in the quiet of gardens, the sound of temple bells, the rustle of wind through shrine gates. It gave meaning to service, comfort in hardship, and dignity in death. For the samurai, to live by the sword was also to live by ritual. To serve one's lord was to serve one's ancestors. To fight with courage was to fight with the awareness of impermanence. And to bow before the altar each day was to remember that the path of the warrior was guided not only by strength, but by faith. If the home was the heart of the samurai household, then the garden was its soul. Beyond walls of wood and paper, beyond the tatami mats and the glow of lamps, lay carefully arranged spaces of stone, water and greenery. Here, the warrior found balance, peace and reflection. The garden was never a place of accident. Every stone, every path, every tree was chosen with care. Its design reflected the philosophy that had shaped the samurai spirit: simplicity, harmony, and discipline. In the quiet curves of a raked gravel bed or the stillness of a pond, the same lessons of Bushido could be felt. Many samurai gardens followed the traditions of Zen design. Gravel, raked into patterns, suggested flowing water. Stones stood like islands or mountains, inviting contemplation. Moss covered shaded corners, softening the hardness of rock. Nothing was placed without intention. To walk through such a garden was to walk through a living poem, where each element spoke in silence. Water was a constant presence. Streams trickled over smooth stones, their sound gentle, steady, unhurried. Ponds mirrored the sky, reflecting clouds, trees, and the shifting light of day. Bridges arched gracefully over water, offering places to pause and reflect. In stillness, the water became a mirror for the soul, reminding the viewer of clarity and impermanence. Paths guided movement. A samurai walking through his garden was never hurried. Each step followed stones set deliberately apart, slowing the pace, encouraging awareness. To stroll through the garden was to practice mindfulness, training the spirit as surely as sword drills trained the body. Plants, too, carried meaning. Pines symbolized endurance, their needles remaining green through winter's cold. Cherry trees bloomed in spring, their blossoms scattering after only a few days, teaching the lesson of life's brief beauty. Bamboo swayed with the wind yet never broke, a symbol of resilience and flexibility. Every season brought new lessons, and the garden reflected them all. Lanterns of stone stood quietly among plants and paths. Their carved forms echoed temples and shrines, reminders that the sacred was always near. At night, when lamps within were lit, their glow softened the darkness, turning the garden into a space of calm mystery. Tea houses often stood within these gardens, simple wooden structures with sliding doors. They were places of retreat. Within, the tea ceremony unfolded, a ritual of measured gestures, of silence and respect. The journey to the tea house, across stepping stones and past water, prepared the mind for the ritual within. By the time one knelt to sip tea, the garden itself had already begun the ceremony. For the samurai, the garden was not a luxury but a necessity. In the stillness of its spaces, he could quiet his mind, reflect upon duty, and prepare for the burdens of service. The sword trained the body, the garden trained the spirit. Together, they formed the balance of the warrior's life. Gardens also reflected status. Wealthier samurai built larger, more elaborate landscapes, with wide ponds, bridges, and sculpted hills. Humble families created smaller yards, yet even the simplest garden carried dignity if arranged with thought. It was never the size that mattered, but the harmony. Children played in these gardens, chasing insects or floating leaves upon streams. Wives tended plants, pruning branches, sweeping paths, arranging flowers for seasonal displays. Retainers raked gravel, maintaining the patterns with patient care. Thus, the garden was not only for reflection, but for life, woven into the rhythms of the household. In times of stress, the garden offered solace. A warrior returning from battle might sit by a pond, watching ripples spread across the water, allowing his heart to settle. In times of mourning, families gathered in silence, drawing comfort from the endurance of trees and the gentle cycle of seasons. The garden also taught impermanence. Blossoms fell, leaves withered, water shifted with every breeze. Nothing was fixed, nothing eternal. To witness this daily was to be reminded of the truth that all things pass. In this way, the garden prepared the samurai for life, for duty, and for death. Thus, the samurai garden was more than decoration. It was philosophy made visible, a mirror of the warrior's spirit, a sanctuary of calm within a world of duty and conflict. To step into it was to step into stillness, to listen not with ears but with the heart, to feel the harmony of stone, water and sky. And in that stillness, the samurai found balance between service and self, between strength and serenity, between the impermanence of blossoms and the endurance of stone. The rhythm of a samurai's life was not measured only by duty or training, but by the turning of the seasons. Japan's climate, with its distinct cycles of spring, summer, autumn, and winter, shaped every aspect of daily living, from food and clothing to rituals, festivals, and even the spirit of the warrior. Each season brought its own lessons, its own trials, and its own beauty. To live as a samurai was to live in harmony with these changes, never apart from the natural flow of time. Spring arrived with the soft fragrance of blossoms drifting through the air. The most beloved of these was the sakura, the cherry tree, whose flowers covered hillsides and temples in fleeting clouds of white and pink. For the samurai, the cherry blossom carried deep meaning. Its beauty was brief, lasting only a few days before scattering upon the wind. In this, it reflected the samurai's own life, noble, beautiful, yet fleeting. Poems were written upon blossoms, and gatherings were held beneath the trees, where warriors and their families shared food, tea, and quiet reflection. Spring was also a time of renewal. Fields were planted, households prepared for the year ahead, and training resumed with vigor after the cold of winter. The air carried both softness and promise, a reminder that life, though impermanent, was always reborn. Summer brought long days of sun and heavy rains that swelled rivers and rice fields. For the samurai, it was a season of endurance. Heat tested the body, while storms tested the spirit. Clothing lightened, with simple cotton robes replacing heavier garments. Meals grew fresher and cooler. Chilled noodles, slices of melon, tea poured over ice. Yet even in the sweltering heat, discipline did not waver. Training continued, often at dawn before the sun grew harsh, or in shaded courtyards where breezes offered some relief. Summer was also a season of festivals. Lanterns glowed in the evenings, drums echoed through villages, and fireworks lit the night sky. These moments of joy reminded warriors and farmers alike that life was not only duty, but also celebration. The sound of cicadas filled the air, their relentless chorus a soundtrack of persistence, urging all who heard them to endure. Autumn was the season of ripening fields and golden light. Rice harvests filled storehouses, and families offered thanks for the bounty of the land. For the samurai, autumn carried a sense of both abundance and melancholy, as the beauty of the world reached its peak before fading into winter. Leaves turned crimson and gold, painting mountains and temples in brilliant colors. Poets compared them to flames, bright yet fleeting, another reminder of impermanence. Samurai walked among these falling leaves, composing verses or reflecting upon the year's struggles and triumphs. Autumn meals were hearty: mushrooms, chestnuts, persimmons, and grilled fish. Tea was sipped slowly, warming hands in the cooling air. Families gathered to share stories, their laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves outside. It was also a time of preparation. Repairs were made to homes, firewood was stacked high, and supplies were stored. Just as training prepared the body for war, autumn prepared the household for the long quiet of winter. Winter descended with snow upon rooftops and silence upon gardens. The air grew sharp, rivers slowed with ice, and nights stretched long. For the samurai, winter was a season of resilience. Homes centered around the hearth. Families gathered close, warmth shared in bowls of hot miso soup and steaming rice. Lamps glowed softly against the paper walls, while outside the world lay hushed beneath white drifts. The sound of the wind across snow was a teacher of patience, reminding all that even the harshest trials would pass. Training did not cease. Warriors practiced indoors, repeating forms with wooden swords, or rode out into snow-covered fields to test their endurance. Winter hardened the body and steeled the spirit. To move with grace in cold, to draw the bow with frozen fingers, was to prove discipline beyond comfort. Winter also carried a spiritual depth. Temples stood quiet in snow, their bells echoing through frosty air. Families visited shrines at year's end, offering prayers for the coming year, bowing beneath lanterns that glowed against the darkness. These rituals gave hope, a reminder that after silence, renewal would come again. Together, the seasons shaped the life of the samurai. Spring taught renewal, summer endurance, autumn reflection, and winter resilience. Each carried lessons that mirrored the values of Bushido. A samurai lived not apart from nature, but within it. His meals changed with the fields, his clothing with the weather, his spirit with the blossoms and the snow. Just as his sword was an extension of himself, so too were the seasons an extension of his life. To walk through the year was to walk through a cycle of training, gratitude, and reflection. And in that cycle, the samurai found harmony between duty and beauty, between strength and fragility, between the fleeting moment and the eternal rhythm of time. While the seasons gave a larger rhythm to samurai life, each single day carried its own order. From dawn to dusk, the household moved according to patterns shaped by duty. training, and ritual. A day in the life of a samurai was not hurried, yet it was never without purpose. Every moment carried weight, and even the simplest actions were tied to the way of service. The day began early. Long before the sun fully rose, households stirred. The soft crow of roosters, the rustle of servants preparing fires, and the distant sound of temple bells marked the arrival of morning. A samurai awoke not to leisure, but to responsibility. At dawn, prayers or bows were made to household shrines. A small offering of rice or water was placed upon the kamedana, a gesture of gratitude to the kami and ancestors. In these moments, the samurai reminded himself that each day was both gift and duty. Morning training often followed. Youths practiced with wooden swords in courtyards, their strikes echoing in rhythm. Others mounted horses, riding across fields in the cool air. Archers stood at targets, releasing arrows into the silence of dawn. These practices prepared the body, sharpened the mind, and reminded all of discipline. Breakfast was simple: bowls of rice, miso soup, and pickled vegetables. It was nourishment for duty, never indulgence. Families ate quietly, each person mindful of their role in the day ahead. As the sun rose higher, the work of the day unfolded. Samurai were not only warriors, they were also administrators, stewards of land, and leaders of households. Many spent their mornings overseeing estates. They met with retainers, checked accounts, or inspected fields. Rice was the foundation of wealth, and its management was as vital as swordsmanship. Ensuring that farmers were cared for, that taxes were collected, and that lands were secure was part of the samurai's role. In castle towns, samurai might attend their lord, reporting on duties or standing guard. Rank determined tasks. High retainers advised in councils, while lower retainers served as messengers, escorts, or guards. Each position carried honor, for service itself was the measure of worth. Children and youths devoted mornings to study. Tutors guided them in reading Chinese classics, copying characters, and composing poetry. Lessons in courtesy and etiquette prepared them for public life, teaching the grace expected of their station. By midday, meals were taken. Rice remained the staple, often joined by fish or vegetables. Tea refreshed the body, poured carefully, savored slowly. Even meals were moments of mindfulness, conducted with dignity and restraint. Afternoons often brought further training. Warriors practiced sword forms, riding drills, or archery competitions. Some engaged in mock battles, learning strategy and teamwork. Others trained indoors, perfecting stances and movements in repetition. Training was not confined to youth. Even seasoned warriors continued to practice, for discipline was lifelong. Households bustled with activity. Women managed servants, prepared stores of food, or instructed daughters in tasks of management and ritual. Gardens were tended, paths swept, and offerings refreshed at shrines. Every corner of the household reflected order, each person contributing to harmony. In quieter hours, education resumed. Calligraphy, music, or painting filled afternoons. Warriors wrote letters, composed verses, or studied history. These arts were not leisure alone. They balanced the sword with refinement, teaching patience and mindfulness. As the sun lowered, households gathered together. Evening meals were often the most communal, shared in calm atmosphere. Stories might be told, poems recited, or news exchanged. Children listened to elders speak of ancestors or past battles, absorbing lessons of loyalty and honor. After dinner, moments of reflection filled the home. Lamps glowed softly behind paper screens, casting warm light across tatami floors. Some sat in gardens, listening to the sound of water or the rustle of night breezes. Others copied texts or composed poems, allowing the mind to settle. For many, evenings were the time of balance, a pause between duty and rest. As darkness deepened, homes grew quiet. Guards stood at gates or patrolled castle walls, their presence ensuring safety. Within, families slept upon mats, covered with quilts, the air filled with the faint scent of oil lamps or incense fading from earlier prayers. The night was not only for sleep. For the samurai, it was also a time of watchfulness. Dangers often came in silence, and readiness was expected at all times. A sword might rest near at hand, armor prepared for sudden call. Even in rest, discipline remained. In winter, nights were long, filled with the sound of wind across roofs and snow falling upon gardens. In summer, nights were alive with the hum of insects and the glow of lanterns at village festivals. Each season gave the night its own character, but always it carried the same quiet, a reminder that the warrior's life was lived as much in stillness as in action. Thus, a day in the life of a samurai was neither hurried nor idle. From dawn prayers to midnight silence, it unfolded with purpose. Training strengthened the body, study sharpened the mind, and ritual nurtured the spirit. Family bonds wove through every hour, as did loyalty to lord and ancestors. No moment was wasted, even in the simplest actions, bowing before a shrine, lifting a bowl of rice, practicing a brushstroke. The samurai practiced discipline. The rhythm of a single day reflected the rhythm of a lifetime, each gesture echoing the greater path of Bushido. And so, in the quiet cycle of morning, noon, evening and night, the samurai lived not only as a warrior, but as a servant of order, of family, and of the way itself. The story of Zen and the samurai begins in the 12th and 13th centuries, a time when Japan was undergoing deep change. The old courtly world of Kyoto, with its poets and courtiers, was giving way to a new order, one dominated by warriors. Amidst this shift, a philosophy arrived from across the sea that would shape the very heart of the samurai spirit. This philosophy was Zen Buddhism. Born in China as Chan, and carried to Japan by monks who traveled across the waters, Zen was not a religion of elaborate rituals or grand doctrines. Instead, it was a teaching of simplicity, of silence, and of direct experience. It taught that truth could not always be found in words, but in the stillness of the mind. For the warrior class, Zen felt familiar, as if it spoke directly to their lives. The samurai lived with the constant presence of death. Each battle, each mission, carried risk. In such a life, the teachings of impermanence, that all things are fleeting, like blossoms that fall after only a few days, resonated deeply. Zen did not deny the harshness of the world, instead it embraced it, offering a way to meet impermanence with calm acceptance. Monks such as Eisai and Dogen carried Zen from China to Japan, founding temples that soon became centers of learning and reflection. These temples did not stand apart from society, but wove themselves into the lives of the samurai. Warriors visited them for guidance, for discipline, and for the stillness that only meditation could bring. Zen emphasized simplicity. A single flower in a vase, a stone set carefully in a garden, a cup of tea prepared with care. These could hold as much meaning as a long sermon. For the samurai, who valued restraint and clarity, this simplicity felt natural. Just as the warrior's life was stripped of excess, so too was Zen stripped of distraction. Zen also emphasized discipline. Hours of sitting in meditation, repeating sword forms, or raking gravel in precise lines were all paths to the same goal, mastery of the self. A samurai who could not control his mind could not control his sword. Through Zen, the warrior found a training of spirit that mirrored his training of body. In this way, Zen and the samurai came together. One offered stillness, the other discipline. One taught impermanence, the other lived with it daily. Together, they created a way of life that was both practical and profound, shaping not only how the samurai fought, but how they thought, prayed, and even how they drank tea. At the heart of Zen was a practice as simple as it was profound: zazen, or seated meditation. A samurai who entered a Zen temple would find no grand altars, no elaborate rituals. Instead, he would find a hall filled with quiet figures, sitting motionless upon mats, their backs straight, their breathing steady. For the untrained, zazen could feel difficult. To sit in silence, with no movement, no speech, and no distraction, was a challenge greater than many battles. The legs ached, the mind wandered, and the minutes stretched into hours. Yet this was the training to master the self, to calm the restless mind, to find clarity in stillness. For the samurai, this practice carried deep meaning. In battle, fear was a constant companion. The clamor of weapons, the cries of men, the uncertainty of survival, all pressed heavily upon the spirit. But a warrior who had learned zazen could step into this storm with a steady heart. He had already faced the chaos of his own mind, and had learned not to cling to fear, nor to be distracted by thoughts of life or death. Meditation also trained the breath. A samurai in zazen breathed slowly, deeply, each inhale and exhale steady and deliberate. This control of breath mirrored the control of motion in combat. To draw a bowstring smoothly, to hold a sword with balance, to ride with grace, all required calm breathing. Through meditation, the warrior learned to bring this calm into every action. Zen taught the concept of mushin, no mind. This was not emptiness in the sense of nothingness, but freedom from hesitation. In mushin, the mind no longer clung to doubt, fear, or distraction. The body acted naturally, without delay, as if sword and spirit were one. For a samurai, this state was invaluable. A moment's hesitation could mean death. But in mushin, there was no hesitation, only action, clear and unbroken. Temples often placed warriors in gardens or halls where silence reigned. The sound of wind through pines, the drip of water into a stone basin, the distant bell of a temple, these became companions of meditation. To sit in such a place, motionless for hours, was to learn that strength was not always in movement, but in stillness. Some warriors recorded their reflections after meditation. Their words speak of calm minds and sharpened spirits. One samurai wrote that in silence he saw his own death 1,000 times, and so when battle came, he no longer feared it. Another wrote that in stillness, he came to understand the movements of others more clearly, as if the mind had become a mirror reflecting the world without distortion. Meditation was not practiced only in temples. Many samurai carried it into their daily lives. A warrior might sit quietly before training, steadying his mind before lifting a sword. Others meditated before important decisions, seeking clarity before acting. Even the act of polishing armor, arranging tea, or walking slowly through a garden could become a form of meditation if done with mindfulness. In this way, Zen transformed the samurai's understanding of courage. Bravery was no longer only the willingness to face danger. It was the ability to remain calm within it, to act without fear, to live fully in the moment without clinging to what might come. Through meditation, the samurai learned that courage was not found in shouting or defiance, but in silence and clarity. Thus, Zazen became more than a spiritual practice. It was a form of training, as vital as archery or swordsmanship. It shaped the mind as discipline shaped the body. And in the calm breath of meditation, the samurai discovered the still point from which all action flowed. Zen did not remain confined to temple halls or meditation mats. Its influence spilled into every aspect of culture, shaping the arts that surrounded the samurai. Through brush, ink, stone and tea, Zen taught the warrior that refinement was as necessary as discipline, and that beauty was found not in excess but in simplicity. One of the most direct connections between Zen and the arts was calligraphy. Monks often brushed single characters onto paper with bold, unhesitating strokes. These were not polished works for display, but expressions of spirit in a single moment. The brush revealed the mind, hesitation showed in broken lines, calmness in fluid motion. For the samurai, this was more than art, it was training. To lift the brush as one lifted the sword, to act without hesitation, to allow body and mind to move as one. This was the practice of mushin made visible. A single character, brushed with steady hand, carried the same energy as a strike of the blade. From calligraphy grew ink painting. Landscapes of mountains, rivers and temples were rendered with a few strokes of black upon white. The simplicity was deliberate. Empty space was not absence, but presence. A reminder that what was left unsaid could be as powerful as what was expressed. Samurai collected these works, studied them, and sometimes painted their own. Zen also influenced poetry, especially the short, concentrated forms of waka and, later, haiku. These poems captured fleeting moments, the fall of a blossom, the sound of a bell, the stillness of snow. Their power lay in brevity, in evoking depth with few words. A warrior might compose a verse before battle, distilling his thoughts into a handful of syllables. Others wrote poems at the turning of seasons, or at the birth of a child, or at the approach of death. Through poetry, the samurai expressed both discipline and sensitivity, strength balanced by awareness of beauty and impermanence. Perhaps the most famous expression of Zen refinement was the tea ceremony. What began as the simple act of drinking powdered green tea in temples became, under Zen influence, a ritual of discipline, harmony and respect. In a small tea house built of wood and paper, a host prepared tea for guests with precise, deliberate movements. Every gesture, folding a cloth, lifting a bowl, pouring water, was performed with mindfulness. Silence often filled the room, broken only by the sound of boiling water and the whisk of bamboo against porcelain. For the samurai, the tea ceremony was not indulgence but training. It taught patience, humility, and attention to detail. To bow before entering the tea house, to sit in quiet respect, to drink with gratitude, these mirrored the values of Bushido. In the measured flow of tea, the warrior found the same clarity he sought in meditation. Zen also shaped the gardens of Japan, many of which were tended by or for samurai households. Stones, moss, gravel, and water were arranged with care, creating landscapes of calm. To rake gravel into flowing lines, to prune a tree into graceful shape, to place a lantern at just the right spot, these acts were themselves meditation. In such gardens, the samurai could walk slowly, step by deliberate step, training the mind to match the quiet harmony of nature. Each season transformed the garden, reminding the warrior that all things change, that beauty is found in cycles, not permanence. Through these arts, Zen taught the samurai that strength alone was not enough. A warrior who lacked refinement risked becoming a brute. But one who cultivated poetry, calligraphy, tea, and gardens carried balance. His sword was sharp, but so was his spirit. Thus, the arts of refinement were never separate from the warrior's path. They were the other side of discipline, not the clash of steel, but the stroke of a brush, not the chaos of battle, but but the silence of tea. In their simplicity, these arts embodied the same clarity that guided the warrior's life. While Zen shaped the arts of poetry, gardens, and tea, its most profound influence upon the samurai was found in the practice of the sword. For the warrior, the blade was not merely a weapon, it was a mirror of the spirit, a test of discipline, and a path toward clarity. Zen gave meaning to this path, teaching the samurai to fight not only with strength, but with stillness of mind. From youth, samurai were trained in kenjutsu, the art of the sword. Stances were repeated endlessly, cuts practiced until they became instinct. Yet without control of the mind, skill of the body was incomplete. A trembling hand, a distracted thought, a moment's hesitation, any could mean defeat. Zen offered a solution. It taught the concept of mushin, no mind. In this state, the warrior acted without hesitation, without fear, without clinging to thought. The sword moved as naturally as breath. The body responded to the moment without delay. For the samurai, mushin was not theory, it was survival. Zen meditation had already taught the samurai the rhythm of breath. On the battlefield, this became invaluable. A steady inhale calmed the body. A steady exhale steadied the strike. Archers used breath to release arrows smoothly. Swordsmen timed their cuts to exhalation, letting the body flow without strain. In this way, every strike was rooted in the same clarity as meditation. Zen also helped the samurai confront fear. Death was never far. A battle could end in a single moment, and no armor could guarantee survival. Zen did not deny this truth. Instead, it embraced it. Just as blossoms fell from trees in spring, so too did lives fall in their time. Through Zen, the samurai learned to accept this impermanence. Death was not an enemy to flee, but a companion always near. By meditating upon mortality, by rehearsing it in silence, the warrior entered battle already prepared. Fear lost its power, and in its place came clarity. In combat, there was no time for reflection. Decisions had to be immediate. To hesitate was to fall. Zen trained the samurai to act fully in the present moment. Past and future dissolved, only the now remained. This clarity was not only for single strikes, but for the flow of battle. A warrior who lived in the present could anticipate movements, sense the rhythm of the fight, and respond with precision. He did not cling to mistakes or fear what might come. Each moment was complete in itself. Zen masters often taught through paradox. They spoke in koans, riddles, or questions that defied logic. What is the sound of one hand clapping? If you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. Such sayings startled the mind, forcing students to move beyond rational thought into direct experience. Samurai teachers used similar methods. A student might be struck suddenly during training, not as punishment, but as a reminder to remain aware. Another might be asked to perform impossible tasks, teaching him to abandon expectation and act naturally. These lessons trained warriors to release the mind from clutter, to find clarity in surprise. For many, swordsmanship became a form of moving meditation. Just as monks sat in stillness, warriors moved in silence. Every step, every strike, every pause mirrored the lessons of the meditation hall. The battlefield itself became a place of Zen, where life and death unfolded in the space of a single breath. In this sense, the sword was not only a tool of war, but a spiritual path. To master the sword was to master the self, to act without fear, to strike without hesitation, to live fully in the moment. These were as much teachings of Zen as of combat. Thus, Zen and the sword became inseparable. One gave meaning to the other. Zen taught the samurai that victory lay not only in strength, but in clarity. The sword taught Zen that stillness could be found even in motion. Together they shaped the samurai into warriors unlike any other. Men who could face death with calm, act with precision, and carry discipline in both silence and steel. The influence of Zen upon the samurai was not confined to temples, gardens, or the edge of a sword. It seeped quietly into daily life, shaping how warriors lived, how they dressed, how they ate, and how they carried themselves in moments both great and small. Zen became not only a philosophy, but a rhythm of being. Zen taught the beauty of simplicity, and this was reflected in the samurai home. Rooms were sparsely furnished, tatami mats, sliding screens, a low table, perhaps a single scroll or flower in an alcove. Nothing was excessive. The emptiness of the room was itself part of its design, a reminder that space could be as meaningful as form. Clothing, too, reflected restraint. Robes of cotton or silk were often plain, their colors muted, their patterns modest. A crest might be displayed, but it was subtle, a mark of identity rather than pride. Even armor, though crafted with care, balanced beauty with function, never indulging in ornament beyond what dignity required. Everyday tasks were performed with the same mindfulness as meditation. To sweep a floor, to polish armor, to prepare rice, each could be done with awareness. Each became an act of discipline. Zen taught that enlightenment was not distant, but present in every action. For the samurai, this was practical wisdom. Duty was constant, and to find clarity within it gave peace to the spirit. Zen also shaped the way samurai carried themselves. Calmness in speech, steadiness in gesture, and dignity in bearing were valued as much as prowess in combat. A warrior who spoke rashly or acted with haste revealed lack of discipline, but one who moved with measured calm reflected strength greater than any weapon. Even in moments of anger or insult, restraint was praised. To answer an offense with silence, to bow with dignity rather than strike in haste, showed mastery of self. This calmness was not weakness, but control, the same control learned in meditation and practiced with the sword. Zen encouraged a deep awareness of the natural world. Samurai found beauty in the sound of rain upon roofs, in the sight of moonlight upon water, in the stillness of snow upon gardens. These moments of harmony were not indulgence, but lessons, reminders of impermanence, of cycles, of balance. Walks through gardens or forests became quiet meditations. To notice the shape of a leaf, the curve of a stone, the call of a bird, these were as much teachings as any text. Nature itself was a teacher, and the samurai who listened to it carried its lessons into his life. Most of all, Zen merged with Bushido, the way of the warrior. Where Bushido emphasized honor, loyalty, and duty, Zen offered the inner strength to live them without fear. Together they created a path that balanced the outer demands of service with the inner calm of spirit. A samurai who practiced Zen was not free from struggle. He still faced the hardships of war, the burdens of duty, the weight of honor. But Zen gave him tools, the ability to sit in stillness, to act without hesitation, to find peace even in impermanence. Even after the great battles ended, even after the swords were sheathed in times of peace, the influence of Zen remained. It shaped how tea was poured, how gardens were tended, how letters were written. It lingered in the calmness of bowing before a shrine, in the steady brushstroke of a poem, in the quiet way a samurai walked through his home. Zen did not change the samurai into monks. It did not remove him from the world of duty and war. Instead, it gave him balance, a way to live fully within that world without being consumed by it. And so, through the centuries, Zen remained at the heart of the warrior's way, guiding him not only in battle, but in life itself. For centuries, emperors in Kyoto were honored as divine rulers, descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Their courts glowed with poetry, music, and ceremony. Yet by the late 12th century, this elegant world had grown fragile. Wealth and real power had slipped away from the emperor's hands, flowing instead to the great warrior families who commanded swords, lands, and loyalty. Among these clans, two stood above all, the Taira and the Minamoto. Their rivalry came to dominate Japan, leading to the Great Genpei War of the 1180s. Across mountains, rivers, and coasts, battles raged as both families sought control of the nation. It was in this crucible of conflict that the figure of Minamoto no Yoritomo rose to prominence. Yoritomo was not the most daring fighter. That honor often went to his cousin Yoshitsune. But Yoritomo was a strategist, both in war and in politics. From his base at Kamakura, far from the intrigues of Kyoto, he built alliances, secured loyalty, and laid the foundation of a new order. When victory came, it was Yoritomo who held the reins. In 1192, the emperor granted him the title of Sei Taishogun, Great General, Subduer of the Barbarians. On the surface, it was an imperial appointment, a recognition of military service. But in truth, it marked the beginning of something far greater. From this moment, the emperor remained a sacred figurehead, while true authority rested with the shogun. Yoritomo's government became known as the Bakufu, or tent government, a term born from the military tents of field commanders. Its capital was Kamakura, a practical, defensible city, chosen deliberately over Kyoto. Where Kyoto still shimmered with courtiers and poets, Kamakura echoed with the hoofbeats of horses and the discipline of warriors. The system rested on loyalty and land. Samurai pledged service to their lords, and in return received the right to hold land and collect income from it. In times of war, they rode out at their lord's call. In times of peace, they managed estates, ensuring stability for the realm. This web of duty and reward tied the warrior class together, giving Yoritomo's government strength that the imperial court could no longer command. Thus began the Kamakura shogunate, the first of Japan's military governments. It was not a rejection of the emperor, but a reshaping of power. The emperor remained revered, but the sword now ruled. And with this shift, Japan entered an age where the way of the warrior became the way of the nation. When Minamoto no Yoritomo established his government in Kamakura, he created more than a new seat of power. He created a new way of governing Japan. Unlike the elegant courts of Kyoto, where poetry and ceremony had ruled for centuries, Kamakura was a city of warriors. It reflected the discipline, practicality, and directness of the samurai themselves. The structure of government was simple but effective. At its head stood the shogun, holding supreme authority over military and political affairs. Below him were trusted retainers, who managed different aspects of rule, law, land, taxation, and the conduct of samurai. This system gave warriors real responsibility, and ensured that power rested in capable hands rather than distant courtiers. For the samurai class, life under the Kamakura shogunate was defined by duty and land. In return for loyalty and military service, samurai were granted estates or the right to collect income from them. This created a bond of obligation. The samurai owed his lord protection and service, and the lord owed his samurai stability and support. This web of loyalty stretched outward, binding the warrior class into a single fabric of society. Daily life for samurai in this era reflected both their martial role and their responsibilities as landholders. Training with bow and sword remained constant, but so too did the work of managing villages, resolving disputes, and ensuring taxes were delivered. A warrior might ride out to hunt one day, drill with his men the next, and then oversee a harvest or a legal matter the day after. In this way, the samurai became both soldier and administrator, balancing steel with stewardship. The influence of Zen Buddhism also deepened during this time. Monks found in Kamakura's warriors an audience receptive to teachings of discipline and impermanence. Samurai visited temples, sought guidance, and practiced meditation. In return, Zen gave them calmness before battle, refinement in daily life, and a philosophy that harmonized with Bushido. Yet life under the Kamakura shogunate was not without hardship. Power brought responsibility, and responsibility often meant sacrifice. Wars continued, disputes arose, and loyalty was tested again and again. But through it all, the samurai grew into their role as Japan's ruling class. The Kamakura period set patterns that would endure for centuries. The bond between lord and vassal, the marriage of sword and service, and the presence of warriors at the very center of government. What Yoritomo began became the foundation for the age of the shoguns, an age in which the warrior's path became inseparable from the nation's destiny. In the late 13th century, the Kamakura shogunate faced a threat unlike any Japan had seen before. An enemy not from within its own shores, but from across the sea. The Mongol Empire, under the rule of Kublai Khan, stretched across Asia, conquering vast lands with speed and ferocity. By the 1270s, Kublai's gaze turned toward Japan. The first invasion came in a Mongol fleet carrying tens of thousands of soldiers, Mongols, Koreans, and Chinese, crossed the waters of the Tsushima Strait. They landed on the islands of Tsushima and Iki, overwhelming local defenders, then pressed toward Kyushu. The samurai who faced them encountered a new style of warfare. The Mongols fought in tightly organized units, using thunderous drums to signal commands. Explosive bombs, unfamiliar to Japanese warriors, burst upon the battlefield, startling men and horses alike. For the samurai, who were accustomed to single combat and duels of honor, this was a shock. The Mongols fought as one, pressing their advantage with discipline and coordination. Yet the defenders resisted fiercely, and after a day of brutal fighting near Hakata Bay, a storm forced the invaders to retreat. 7 years later, in 1281, the Mongols returned with an even greater force, perhaps the largest invasion fleet assembled in history up to that time. 2 armadas, one from Korea and one from China, converged upon Kyushu. Samurai across Japan were summoned to defend the coast. For weeks battles raged along beaches and fortifications hastily built after the first invasion. The fighting was desperate, with Japanese warriors boarding Mongol ships in daring night raids. Then nature intervened. A massive typhoon swept across Kyushu, scattering and sinking much of the Mongol fleet. Ships were dashed against rocks, soldiers drowned in the sea, and the invasion collapsed. The Japanese named this storm the kamikaze, the divine wind, believing it had been sent by the gods to protect their land. Though victorious, the shogunate paid a heavy price. Defending the realm strained its resources, and because the invasions had been repelled rather than conquered, there was no new land to distribute as rewards. Samurai who had fought bravely often received little compensation, leading to growing discontent. Yet the Mongol invasions left a lasting legacy. They strengthened the sense of Japan as a nation protected by divine favor. They revealed the courage and resilience of the samurai, who faced overwhelming odds and endured. and they reminded the warrior class that their duty was not only to their lords but to the defense of their entire homeland. The victory over the Mongols had secured Japan from foreign conquest, but it left the Kamakura shogunate weakened. Samurai had fought bravely, yet many received little reward for their service. Discontent simmered, and within a few decades cracks appeared in the system Yoritomo had built. By the early 14th century, the Kamakura Bakufu collapsed, and a new military government rose in its place, the Ashikaga shogunate. The Ashikaga were a branch of the powerful Minamoto clan. In 1336, Ashikaga Takauji seized power after breaking with the imperial court, establishing his government in Kyoto. Unlike Kamakura, far from the old capital, the Ashikaga shogunate placed itself directly in the cultural and political heart of Japan. This brought the warriors closer to the refined world of the court, and the two spheres, martial and artistic, became more intertwined. Life under the Ashikaga shogunate was less stable than under Kamakura. Authority was weaker, and regional daimyos, powerful local lords, held significant independence. The country often fractured into competing domains, with loyalty divided between central authority and regional power. Yet despite political turbulence, this era became a golden age of art and culture, especially under the rule of Ashikaga Yoshimitsu in the late 14th century. Zen Buddhism flourished, influencing architecture, painting, and gardens. The famous Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion in Kyoto, was built during this time, a temple whose shimmering reflection upon the water became an enduring symbol of Japanese beauty. Ink paintings, calligraphy, and the art of the tea ceremony all deepened their ties to samurai culture. The warrior class, even as it fought in civil wars, also became patrons of refinement. For ordinary samurai, however, life was often uncertain. Conflicts between rival lords, shifting allegiances, and constant unrest meant that battles could erupt at any moment. Yet in this instability, the skills of the warrior sharpened, and the bonds of loyalty were tested again and again. The Ashikaga period laid the groundwork for what was to come, the Sengoku era, an age of nearly constant war, but it also left a legacy of cultural brilliance, showing that even in times of political chaos, beauty could flourish. The Ashikaga shogunate was not as strong as Kamakura had been, yet its influence endured in the arts that still define Japan today. By the mid-15th century, the authority of the Ashikaga shogunate had weakened so greatly that Japan fractured into chaos. Powerful regional lords, known as daimyo, began to rule their lands like independent kingdoms, and their samurai armies clashed in endless conflict. This period, lasting from the late 1400s into the late 1500s, became known as the Sengoku era, the age of warring states. For more than a century, war was a constant presence. Castles rose upon hilltops, overlooking fields where peasants toiled not only to feed themselves, but to supply armies. Samurai marched under banners, fighting not for a united nation, but for the ambitions of their lords. Battles were fierce, alliances shifted quickly, and betrayal was common. A warrior could rise to glory one season and fall to ruin the next. Daily life during this era was harsh. For peasants, it meant heavy burdens of labor, frequent conscription, and the ever-present threat of destruction. Villages were burned, fields trampled, and families scattered. For samurai, the Sengoku period was both an age of opportunity and of danger. With loyalty and skill, a warrior could climb the ranks, perhaps gaining land or title. Yet the risk of death was constant, and loyalty often demanded sacrifice. The warfare of this era also saw change. Large armies fought with pikes, bows and swords, but new technologies arrived as well. In the 16th century, firearms were introduced by Portuguese traders, and samurai quickly adapted. Muskets changed the rhythm of battle, allowing disciplined volleys of fire that could break even the fiercest cavalry charge. Despite the violence, the Sengoku era was also a time of resilience. Samurai families continued to uphold Bushido, teaching loyalty, honor, and duty even in the midst of chaos. Temples and shrines offered places of refuge, while poets and painters still created works that celebrated the fleeting beauty of nature. The contrast between war and refinement defined the age, a reminder that even in turmoil, the spirit sought balance. The Sengoku period produced legendary figures, daimyo whose ambition and vision would eventually lead Japan out of endless war. Their rise marked the beginning of a new chapter, where unity seemed once again possible. But for most who lived through it, the Sengoku era was a time of uncertainty, where the only constant was the clash of steel and the turning of fortunes. Out of the chaos of the Sengoku era rose three men whose ambition and vision reshaped Japan. Together, they are remembered as the great unifiers: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Each brought the nation closer to unity. though each did so in his own way. Oda Nobunaga was the first. Fierce, ruthless, and innovative, he shattered traditions that had kept warfare predictable. He was among the earliest to embrace firearms, organizing musketeers into disciplined ranks that decimated cavalry. Nobunaga broke powerful rivals and brought Kyoto under his control. Yet his harsh methods earned him many enemies, and in 1582 he was betrayed by a vassal and forced to end his life. Into the power vacuum stepped Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Nobunaga's loyal general. Hideyoshi's story was remarkable. Born a peasant, he rose through skill, cunning and charm to become the ruler of Japan. Hideyoshi continued Nobunaga's campaigns, bringing more provinces under control. He built magnificent castles, instituted reforms, and imposed strict separation between classes, ensuring that samurai remained warriors while farmers tilled the land. Ambitious even beyond Japan, he launched invasions of Korea, though these ultimately failed. The third unifier was Tokugawa Ieyasu. Patient, calculating, and strategic, he waited until the time was right. After Hideyoshi's death, Ieyasu maneuvered among rivals, finally seizing decisive victory at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. With this triumph, he became master of Japan, laying the foundation for a new era of peace under Tokugawa rule. Together, these three transformed Japan from a fractured land of constant war into a nation on the brink of unity. Nobunaga broke the old order, Hideyoshi built upon it, and Ieyasu secured it. Their legacy shaped the centuries to come, bringing an end to the chaos of the Sengoku era and opening the path to lasting stability. With Tokugawa Ieyasu's victory at Sekigahara, a new chapter began. In 1603, he was appointed shogun, establishing the Tokugawa shogunate. Its capital was Edo, modern-day Tokyo, which grew from a modest castle town into one of the largest cities in the world. The Tokugawa shogunate would last for more than 250 years, bringing Japan its longest period of peace and stability. Samurai, once warriors of constant battle, now found themselves in a new role. With wars rare, many became administrators, scholars or officials, managing the affairs of their lords rather than riding to war. The sword remained a symbol of their status, but its use shifted from battlefield to ceremony. Society was reorganized with strict order. At the top stood the shogun, followed by daimyo, samurai, farmers, artisans and merchants. Travel was restricted, foreign influence tightly controlled, and loyalty enforced through systems such as the Sankin Kotai, which required lords to spend alternating years in Edo, ensuring their obedience. For ordinary people, life grew more predictable. Farmers tilled their fields, artisans crafted goods, merchants prospered in growing towns. Festivals flourished, theatres thrived, and culture blossomed in ways not possible during the centuries of war. For the samurai, however, peace was a double-edged sword. Their prestige remained, but their traditional role as warriors faded. Many struggled to adapt, finding new purpose in learning, governance, or the arts. Still, Bushido endured, shaping their conduct even in peace. The Tokugawa era was one of remarkable endurance. For 2.5 centuries, the shogunate maintained stability, keeping Japan largely free from internal conflict. It was a time when the ideals of the samurai continued, even as their swords remained sheathed. Early samurai battles were very different from the massive armies and long campaigns that came later. In the Heian and early Kamakura periods, combat often began with formal challenges. Warriors announced their names, their ancestry, and the deeds of their families before riding forward to duel. Victory in such encounters brought honor not only to the individual but to his clan. These early battles were often chaotic and personal, fought with bows, swords, and lances on horseback. The clash was as much about reputation as about conquest. Samurai saw themselves as champions, proving courage and skill in single combat. Over time, warfare shifted. By the Sengoku era, battles involved thousands of men. Samurai still sought individual glory, but they now fought within organized units under daimyo banners. Colorful standards, carried into battle, showed the presence of great lords. Crests emblazoned on armor, and flags identified each clan. War became both a personal and collective struggle. The nature of samurai warfare thus blended ritual with practicality. Honor remained at its heart, but the reality of larger conflicts demanded discipline, coordination and strategy beyond individual duels. The earliest weapon of the samurai was the yumi, the longbow. Mastery of mounted archery defined the warrior. To guide a horse, draw a bow, and release an arrow in one fluid motion required immense skill. Battles in the early age were dominated by volleys of arrows before warriors closed with swords. Over time, the sword rose in importance. The tachi, worn edge down from the belt, gave way to the shorter katana, worn edge up for a quicker draw. The katana became the symbol of the samurai, not merely a tool of war, but a companion and a soul. Warriors treated their blades with reverence, caring for them as treasures. Other weapons also shaped samurai combat. The yari, or spear, allowed both foot soldiers and mounted warriors to fight with reach and power. The naginata, a curved blade on a long shaft, was favored by both men and women of the warrior class. In the 16th century, firearms arrived from Europe, changing the face of battle. Muskets, though at first strange, soon became integral, used in disciplined volleys that could shatter cavalry charges. Together, these weapons reflected the adaptability of the samurai. Tradition remained, but innovation was embraced when survival demanded it. Samurai armor was designed to protect while allowing movement. Early suits were made of lamella plates bound together with silk cords. The lacquered plates gleamed in battle, strong yet flexible enough for horseback riding and archery. The kabuto, or helmet, was the most distinctive piece. Some were adorned with horns, crests, or sweeping decorations meant to inspire allies and intimidate foes. Beneath the helmet, fearsome masks called menpo covered the face, their fierce expressions giving warriors the appearance of demons. Armor was not only functional, it was also symbolic. Colors and designs reflected family heritage. Every detail reminded the warrior of his duty to clan and lord. As warfare evolved, armor grew lighter, adjusting to the demands of firearms and prolonged campaigns. Yet the kabuto and the mask remained enduring symbols of the samurai spirit. To don armor was to enter a state of readiness. Each strap tied, each plate fitted, was a ritual as much as preparation. Armor shielded the body, but it also clothed the warrior in the dignity of his station. Samurai strategy shifted across centuries. In the early age, mounted archery dominated, with swift charges across open fields. Later, as armies grew larger, warfare expanded to include sieges and castle defenses. Strongholds rose upon hills and plains, their moats and walls turning battles into drawn-out struggles of patience and endurance. Tactics grew more sophisticated. Commanders used terrain to their advantage, forests for ambushes, rivers to divide enemies, mountains for defense. Feigned retreats, surprise attacks, and sudden night raids became common. Victory often came not from strength alone, but from cunning. In the Sengoku era, when daimyo vied for supremacy, battles became massive affairs with thousands of troops. Infantry armed with spears and later muskets fought in disciplined formations. Cavalry charges, once decisive, were now countered by volleys of gunfire, as at the famous Battle of Nagashino. Samurai strategy thus became a blend of old traditions and new innovations, guided by the principle that clarity of mind and flexibility of plan were as vital as steel. Several battles stand as turning points in samurai history. The Battle of Dan-no-ura in 1185 ended the Genpei War between the Taira and Minamoto clans. Fought on the waters of the inland sea, it saw the downfall of the Taira and the rise of Minamoto power, leading to the birth of the first shogunate. Centuries later, the Battle of Nagashino in 1575 showcased the impact of firearms. Oda Nobunaga's disciplined lines of musketeers broke the cavalry of the Takeda clan, proving that the age of mounted charges had ended. The Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 was the most decisive of all. Here, Tokugawa Ieyasu crushed his rivals, paving the way for the Tokugawa shogunate. The battle marked the end of the Sengoku era and the dawn of more than 2 centuries of peace. Each of these battles reflected not only military strength, but also shifts in technology, leadership, and the nature of warfare itself. Behind every battle stood discipline. Samurai trained daily, practicing strikes, archery, and horsemanship. Repetition was endless, each movement honed until it became second nature. This training extended beyond weapons. Meditation, poetry, and etiquette were also part of a warrior's discipline. For mastery of self was as important as mastery of arms. Honor guided the battlefield as much as skill, to fight with courage, to remain loyal to one's lord, to face death without fear. These were the pillars of samurai conduct. Even defeat was not dishonor, if faced with dignity. Victory without loyalty, however, was hollow. This discipline extended into ritual. Before battles, prayers were offered at shrines, armor polished, swords cleaned. After battles, warriors reflected upon their actions, recording deeds in poems or reports. Each act, great or small, was tied to duty and respect. Through discipline, the samurai transformed war into a path of spirit, as much as of steel. It was not enough to win. One had to fight with clarity, courage, and honor, for only then was victory truly complete. For the samurai, the sword was more than steel. It was the spirit of the warrior made visible, called the katana. It came to embody honor, loyalty, and the soul itself. To carry a sword was not only to bear a weapon, but to carry one's identity and dignity. Swords were forged with care, folded steel hammered again and again by master smiths. Each blade carried subtle curves, a tempered edge, and a gleaming surface that reflected both craftsmanship and spirit. Families passed swords down through generations, binding ancestors to descendants. Losing one's sword was losing face, while caring for it was an act of devotion. In this way, the sword became the most enduring symbol of the samurai's way. Though warriors, samurai were also men of letters. They wrote poetry, studied Chinese classics, and left behind journals and treatises. Writing honed discipline, sharpened thought, and gave expression to the spirit. Many samurai favored short poems, especially waka and later haiku, which captured fleeting beauty in a few lines. A single verse about falling blossoms or moonlight on armor could reveal the depth of a warrior's heart. Some wrote death poems before battle, expressing acceptance of impermanence with calm dignity. Others composed manuals on tactics, philosophy, and swordsmanship. Works such as Miyamoto Musashi's Book of Five Rings blended martial skill with spiritual insight, showing that the pen and the sword were not separate, but complementary paths. Zen influence encouraged the arts of brush and ink. Samurai practiced calligraphy, believing that the stroke of the brush revealed the state of the mind, just as the stroke of the sword revealed the state of the spirit. Bold flowing characters showed clarity, hesitant lines revealed doubt. They also took to ink painting, where landscapes of mountains, rivers, and pines were rendered with just a few strokes. Empty space was valued as much as filled lines, silence as important as sound. Warriors collected these works, hung them in their homes, and sometimes painted their own. Art was not leisure, apart from duty. It was training in discipline, patience, and awareness. Few cultural practices embodied the blending of art and discipline as clearly as the tea ceremony. What began as the simple drinking of powdered green tea became, under Zen influence, a ritual of refinement and respect. In a small tea house, the host prepared tea for guests with deliberate, graceful motions. Every gesture, folding a cloth, whisking the tea, offering a bowl, was performed with mindfulness. The setting was simple: tatami mats, paper walls, a scroll in an alcove, perhaps a single flower in a vase. Nothing distracted from the essence of the ritual. For samurai, the tea ceremony was training in humility and focus. To bow, to wait in silence, to drink with gratitude, these mirrored the same values they carried onto the battlefield. In tea, they found serenity that balanced the weight of duty. Samurai patronage shaped the building of castles, temples, and gardens. Castles were fortresses of stone and wood, their towers rising above towns, symbols of authority and strength. Yet within their walls, gardens bloomed, places of stillness that softened the harshness of war. Zen gardens, with their raked gravel, carefully placed stones, and moss-covered corners, reflected harmony and impermanence. To walk these paths, or sit in their stillness, was to train the spirit as much as the body. Samurai found in gardens a mirror of their own way, discipline in arrangement, beauty in simplicity, and calm in impermanence. For the samurai, art and culture were never indulgences apart from their role as warriors. They were part of the same path. To fight without refinement risked becoming a brute. To cultivate art without duty risked becoming idle. True balance lay in uniting both. A samurai who practiced poetry, painting, or tea did not abandon the sword. He sharpened his spirit so that when the sword was drawn, it moved with clarity and purpose. In turn, the weight of duty gave his art depth, grounding beauty in experience. Thus, the samurai's life was not only one of battles and commands, it was also one of verses, gardens, scrolls, and tea bowls, strength and serenity, steel and brush, action and stillness. Together they formed the complete way of the warrior. With the Tokugawa shogunate came peace, 2.5 centuries with no great wars. For farmers, merchants, and artisans, this stability brought growth and prosperity. For samurai, however, peace meant change. The warrior class, once defined by battle, now lived in a world where swords were rarely drawn. Many samurai became administrators, tax collectors, or scholars, serving their lords in governance rather than combat. They studied Confucian texts, kept records, and ensured order in towns and villages. Their armor gathered dust while their brushes grew busy. Though they retained status, their role was shifting, and with it their identity. Samurai were supported by stipends from their lords, usually paid in rice. In times of war, this system had worked well. But in long peace, stipends often fell short of living costs. Many samurai, bound by pride and class rules, struggled to maintain their households. Some took on side work as teachers or writers, while others borrowed heavily, sinking into debt. A few married into merchant families, blending status with wealth, though such unions were not always accepted. These struggles eroded the independence that had once defined the warrior class. Poverty became common, and with it, resentment. The prestige of the samurai remained, but the reality of their lives grew harsher. The sword, once the heart of the samurai's identity, became more symbol than tool. By the Tokugawa era, laws restricted the carrying of weapons, and only samurai were permitted to wear the two swords, the katana and wakizashi. Yet battles to wield them rarely came. The swords rested at a warrior's side in ceremony, a mark of rank and tradition rather than of combat. They became heirlooms, treasures of families, passed down more as relics than as instruments of war. For some, this transformation was dignified, a sign that the sword had transcended violence. For others, it was a reminder that the age of the warrior was fading. Though the Tokugawa era was mostly peaceful, unrest simmered. Some samurai, frustrated by poverty or loss of purpose, joined uprisings. Peasant revolts also erupted, often sparked by hunger or heavy taxation, and sometimes samurai found themselves on the same side as the people they once ruled. Others became ronin, masterless samurai, wandering without lord or land. Some ronin served as teachers, guards, or mercenaries. Others turned to crime. Their presence reminded society of the instability that lay beneath the surface of peace. The most famous act of loyalty from this time was the story of the 47 ronin, who avenged their master despite knowing it would cost them their lives. Their tale became a symbol of enduring bushido, even in an age where samurai seemed adrift. By the 19th century, the world was changing. Western nations, armed with modern weapons and powerful fleets, arrived at Japan's shores demanding trade. The most famous of these visits was in 1853, when American Commodore Perry sailed into Edo Bay with black ships of smoke and iron. For centuries, Japan had been isolated, its doors closed to most foreign contact. Now, it faced demands it could not ignore. The presence of foreign powers exposed the weakness of the Tokugawa system. Samurai, who had lived for generations in peace, now found themselves unprepared for the technology and firepower of the West. This new pressure revealed that the way of the warrior could not remain unchanged. As unrest grew, and foreign influence pressed harder, the authority of the shogunate began to crumble. Some samurai called for resistance, to fight and expel the foreigners. Others believed change was necessary, that Japan must modernize to survive. In this divide, the identity of the samurai fractured. No longer united by clear purpose, they stood at the crossroads of tradition and transformation. The once proud class of warriors, who had ruled Japan for centuries, now faced the slow but certain fading of their role. Their decline was not sudden, but it was inevitable. The world was shifting, and the age of the sword was drawing to a close. By the mid-19th century, the Tokugawa shogunate, once strong and enduring, was crumbling. Foreign ships had forced open Japan's ports, exposing the limits of the old order. Unequal treaties, economic strain, and social unrest revealed that the Bakufu could no longer protect or lead the nation. Samurai across Japan were divided. Some clung to tradition, demanding resistance against foreign powers. Others saw that survival required change, that Japan must adopt new weapons, ships, and systems. The unity that had once defined the warrior class now splintered. In 1868, the old system collapsed. Supporters of the emperor rallied, overthrowing the Tokugawa shogunate and restoring imperial rule in what became known as the Meiji Restoration. The emperor, long a figurehead, was now placed at the center of government. Western-style reforms swept across Japan. New schools, modern industries, conscripted armies, and centralized administration. The age of shoguns was over. For samurai, these changes struck at the heart of their identity. The privileges of their class, stipends, the right to wear swords, their exclusive status were gradually abolished. A new conscript army, drawn from commoners, replaced the warrior elite. Not all samurai accepted this transformation. The most famous resistance came in 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, once a loyal supporter of the Restoration. Disillusioned with the government's direction, he and thousands of fellow warriors rose in revolt, seeking to preserve the samurai way. The conflict, known as the Satsuma Rebellion, was fierce but brief. Modern rifles and artillery gave the government army, drawn from conscripts, a decisive advantage. The rebels fought bravely, charging with swords against guns, but they could not overcome modern firepower. Saigo Takamori fell in battle, becoming a symbol of both loyalty and tragedy. His death marked the true end of the samurai era. Though the class was dissolved, the spirit of the samurai did not vanish. Bushido, the way of the warrior, endured, reshaped into new forms. Discipline, loyalty, honor, and self-mastery continued to inspire Japanese society. In the Meiji era, Bushido was invoked to build national identity. to encourage service to the emperor and devotion to the nation. In later centuries, its ideals influenced martial arts, education, and even business practices. The sword was no longer carried, but its spirit lived on in the values of perseverance and dedication. Today, the samurai remain one of the most enduring symbols of Japan. Their swords rest in museums. Their armor gleams behind glass. Their stories are told in plays, novels, and films. They are remembered as warriors, poets, and guardians of a code that transcended time. The image of the samurai, calm, disciplined, loyal even unto death, continues to inspire not only in Japan but around the world. Their age has passed, yet their presence remains, etched into the memory of a nation and the imagination of humanity. The Meiji Restoration closed the chapter on centuries of samurai rule, but it also opened a new era. Japan emerged into the modern world, transformed. A nation that had shed the armor of the past while carrying forward the spirit of its warriors. The last samurai were not simply men who fought with swords. They were the bridge between tradition and modernity, between the old order and the new. Their decline was an ending, but also a beginning. In their story, we see both the fragility of power and the endurance of spirit. The samurai may have laid down their swords, but their way, their calmness, their courage, their devotion continues to echo across time. We have walked with them from their earliest days, when mounted archers rode across the fields of Japan, to their rise as the ruling class of a nation. We have entered their homes, their gardens, and their temples, seeing how daily rituals and Zen philosophy shaped their spirit. We have stood beside them in battles, from the clash of the Genpei War to the thunder of muskets at Nagashino, and finally to the quiet tragedy of their decline. Though the age of the samurai has passed, their way endures. The sword no longer rules, yet the values of Bushido, loyalty, honor, discipline, and calmness in the face of impermanence remain part of Japan's identity and continue to inspire far beyond its shores. The samurai remind us that strength is not only in steel, but in spirit. That clarity, humility, and devotion give life meaning, even in the face of change. Thank you for joining this journey through history. As the tale of the samurai settles into silence, may you carry with you a sense of calm reflection. May their story, filled with courage and serenity, guide you gently into rest. Good night.